What if the oldest symbols of our world are not what they seem, but echoes of a memory we were never meant to keep? Across ruins scattered like broken constellations, a single shape returns again and again. The small, silent handbag carried by gods, sages, and forgotten beings. It appears where history thins, where something important feels missing, as if a doorway once stood there. Perhaps these figures were not holding an object, but a secret, one that slipped through the cracks of time. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy stories that drift between dream and history. And if you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is. Somewhere in the quiet space between curiosity and doubt, the image of that strange ancient handbag begins to settle like a weight on the mind, small, unassuming, yet recurring across civilizations that were never meant to know of one another. At Göbekli Tepe, it appears high above the stone pillars, carved with a delicacy that contrasts sharply with the rough landscape of 10,000 BCE. In Mesopotamia, it hangs from the wrists of Apkallu sages during the earliest dawn of writing. Far away in Mesoamerica, it rests in the hands of gods who shape the world from maize and breath. These cultures are separated by oceans, millennia, and mythological frameworks so different they might as well belong to separate universes. Yet the motif repeats with a stubborn consistency that refuses to be ignored. It is this quiet refusal, this strange persistence, that unsettles the certainty many historians once believed they had. Archaeologists often describe motifs like these as coincidences of symbolic imagination, as if human creativity naturally bends into the same shapes across continents. And perhaps that is comforting, the belief that we all dreamed the same symbol without ever sharing a whisper. But when one looks closely at the context of each depiction, the comfort begins to shrink. At Göbekli Tepe, the bags float above the heads of animals and celestial shapes. In Assyria, they are carried by beings who are half human, half something else, guardians of knowledge, intermediaries between sky and earth. In Olmec carvings, they are held by deities whose roles revolve around creation and transformation. It feels increasingly difficult to treat this object as a mere artistic coincidence. Instead, it hovers like a forgotten clue, something once obvious to those who carved it, but deeply obscured to us. There is also an unsettling timeline woven through these appearances. Göbekli Tepe predates writing, metallurgy, urban centres, laws and agriculture, as we traditionally understand them. Its builders, according to mainstream chronology, should not have possessed the organisational structure or symbolic complexity to carve such sophisticated images. Yet they did. And in those earliest carvings, the handbag appears fully formed, as if it were already an old symbol even then. That is what gives many researchers pause. Symbols typically evolve, morphing over centuries, but this one arrives complete, mature, refined, strangely confident. It is a maturity that suggests inheritance rather than invention. Some scholars turn to mythology to understand this inheritance. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, knowledge is often carried, protected, or stolen. In Sumerian accounts, the Apkallu, semi-divine sages sent by the gods, bring arts, sciences, and the rituals that bind humanity to order. Their role echoes faintly in other regions, where civilizing heroes appear suddenly, offering tools or guidance before fading into legend. Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, Viracocha in the Andes, Oannes in Babylon, all appear with gifts, teachings, and often with a strange object in hand. When seen through this mythological lens, the recurring handbag might not be an object in the literal sense, but a vessel of something abstract. Knowledge, order, cosmic balance, or perhaps memory itself. Still, the more one explores these myths, the more fragile the boundary becomes between symbolism and something more concrete. The bag's shape is oddly specific, a rectangular container with a curved handle, adjusted with such precision that artists across continents replicated it down to its proportions. If it were symbolic, why not alter it? Why preserve the exact geometry? Why render it with the same solidity, as though describing an actual tool? These questions linger in museum halls and late-night discussions among researchers who quietly admit how little they understand. They linger even more strongly for those who stand at Göbekli Tepe at dawn, watching the first light spill across the limestone pillars, illuminating the ancient grooves as though waking a memory older than agriculture itself. There is another layer of strangeness that unsettles the narrative, the timing of its disappearance. After appearing widely across early sacred art, the motif fades. It doesn't evolve or simplify, it simply stops. Such a clean break is rare in symbolic history. Most symbols erode slowly across generations, losing clarity as cultures shift. But the handbag vanishes with an abruptness that feels intentional, as if it had served its purpose, or as if something changed so drastically that the symbol no longer needed to be preserved. It invites a quiet, uneasy thought. Were these early cultures referencing something that existed only in their era? Something lost before later civilizations began shaping their own mythologies? In academic circles, a few researchers have proposed that the motif might represent a container for ritual seeds, a tool linked to early agricultural myths. Others argue it symbolizes the cosmos, a portable universe held by deities who shaped life. And some suggest it may depict a basket of sacred tools used in rites of initiation or healing. Each hypothesis carries a fragment of plausibility, yet none fully encompass the motif's consistency, its cross-cultural precision, or its sudden extinction. It is like trying to describe a shadow without acknowledging the object that casts it. What makes the mystery even more delicate is the silence surrounding its earliest appearance. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried after centuries of use, for reasons still unknown. It was not destroyed by invaders, nor abandoned by accident. It was entombed intentionally, as though the builders wished to protect something, or to hide it. The act of burial complicates everything. It suggests choice, agency, secrecy. And in that sealed earth, among the pillars arranged like a stone alphabet we can barely read, the handbag sits calmly, carved with the same deliberate hand that shaped the animals, the constellations and the guardians who seem to watch us across time. Sometimes, when contemplating these carvings, one is struck by a quiet possibility. What if the object meant something so fundamental to the people of that age that it required no explanation? What if its meaning faded only because the memory itself faded, eroded not by time but by an event, or a series of events, that severed humanity from whatever came before? The more one considers this, the more the silence around the motif begins to feel like an artifact itself. A silence not of ignorance, but of something once known so deeply that it never needed to be spoken aloud. And perhaps that is why the motif continues to trouble historians and dreamers alike. Not because of what it shows, but because of what it implies. It gestures toward a chapter of human experience that we cannot reach, a chapter that may have been deliberately sealed or quietly forgotten. As the smooth stone curves of Göbekli Tepe catch the twilight, one cannot help but feel that something essential lies just beyond understanding, an echo waiting for the right moment to be heard again. Yet the question remains, subtle but persistent. If this forgotten symbol carried meaning across continents and millennia, then what else might have crossed those same ancient horizons, silently weaving itself into the first stories humanity ever told? There is a peculiar feeling that settles in when one realizes how early the handbag enters the archaeological record. Not at the rise of cities, not in the age of writing or metallurgy, but deep in the twilight before settled life took shape. Its presence at Göbekli Tepe is the earliest anchor we have, yet it appears already perfected, as though the builders were not inventing a new motif but recalling one. This realization unearths a disturbing question rarely spoken aloud. How many symbols have we lost entirely, and why did this one survive long enough to migrate across continents? That survival suggests something more than aesthetic curiosity. It hints at memory, or perhaps inheritance, drifting through time long after its origin dissolved. When researchers study the carvings up close, they often comment on their precision, the steady lines cut by stone tools, the confidence in every stroke. Even with simple implements, the artisans of Göbekli Tepe carved with a mastery that feels at odds with what we assume about the pre-agricultural world. And among the animals, the abstract shapes, and the celestial signs, the handbag sits with an almost casual certainty, as though it required no explanation for those who lived 11,600 years ago. The placement of these carved objects above the heads of animals is particularly striking. In one notable pillar, 3 bags hover like constellations aligned with a symmetry that suggests meaning, perhaps even an order or sequence that we no longer understand. Some archaeologists connect this alignment to celestial events, pointing to evidence that Göbekli Tepe's builders tracked precession, solstices, and the shifting patterns of the sky. If these people mapped the heavens with such precision, then perhaps the handbag does not represent an earthly tool at all, but a conceptual vessel, an idea bound to cosmology. The Archaeastronomy School at the University of Edinburgh once proposed that certain motifs at Göbekli Tepe may reference cometary activity linked to the Younger Dryas cooling event. If ancient communities connected a devastating cosmic impact to the origins of their world, then symbols of control, order, or knowledge might have naturally emerged afterward. The handbag, then, could be less an object and more a metaphor, a container holding the memory of a world changed by catastrophe. Yet this interpretation only deepens another mystery. How did similar motifs appear in regions so distant that contact seems improbable, at least according to conventional timelines? In Mesoamerica, the gods hold comparable objects with the same gently curved handles and squared bodies. Some scholars argue that these are ritual baskets or pouches containing sacred seeds, the very tools of agricultural transformation. But even this connection falters when one remembers the vast distance separating the Americas from the Near East, and the immense gulf of time that lies between their earliest depictions. Unless one entertains the possibility that knowledge itself, symbolic or practical, migrated across unimaginable distances long before we typically acknowledge human interconnectedness. The academic discomfort surrounding these parallels often reveals itself through careful language, coincidence, stylistic convergence, shared cognitive archetypes. These explanations are safe, familiar, protective. Yet they rarely address the core oddity. The shape is too specific, too consistent, and too precisely rendered across context to be dismissed easily. When something repeats with such coherence, it naturally provokes the thought that humanity once shared a deeper, older root, a cultural trunk now lost, remembered only through scattered fragments of symbolism, but saying so aloud challenges the chronological scaffolding upon which modern history rests. And scaffolding, once shaken, tends to reveal how fragile its balance truly is. There is a moment many visitors experience at Göbekli Tepe. Standing within the circular enclosures, one senses a dreamlike disjunction. The pillars rise in pairs, towering above the ground like guardians protecting a memory. The air holds a quiet tension, as if the site itself were waiting for recognition. These enclosures were built with intention, used for centuries, and then buried under layers of stone and earth. This act of burial, rare in human prehistory, remains one of the site's greatest riddles. If the builders sought to preserve their creation, why seal it? And if they sought to hide it, from whom? Some researchers propose that the builders were facing a profound cultural transformation. Perhaps the transition from a mobile hunter-gatherer existence to early forms of agriculture, a shift that altered social structures, beliefs, and ways of understanding the world. Symbols associated with a prior epoch may have lost their stability or become too sacred, too dangerous, or too powerful to leave exposed. And so the site was entombed, not destroyed. The handbag motif in this interpretation becomes a residue of an older worldview, one that the builders sought simultaneously to honor and to obscure, like sealing a cherished memory inside a stone chamber. Mythology offers another thread to follow, though its paths are winding and elusive. In Mesopotamian traditions, the Apkallu brought divine knowledge before the flood. In Mesoamerican stories, Quetzalcoatl arrived bearing gifts of civilization. Across the ancient world, civilizing figures often emerge from the sea, from the mountains, or from distant skies, carrying something that changes humanity forever. Whether these narratives are symbolic retellings of human migrations, memories of lost tribes, or something older still is impossible to determine. But the parallels hint at the possibility that ancient peoples remembered an origin not grounded in gradual evolution, but in sudden transmissions of knowledge. And these transmissions, real or mythic, might have been represented by objects like the bag, a container of teaching, a vessel of order, a portable symbol of transformation. There is a quiet tension between mythology and archaeology. One deals in stories, the other in material. yet symbols often serve as bridges. The handbag may be exactly that, a bridge between the material world and mythic memory, an icon that carried a meaning so essential it survived even when its context did not. And like many ancient symbols, its meaning could have been multi-layered, shifting across regions and eras while retaining its recognizable form. In one place it might have represented seeds, in another the cosmos, in another the tools of sacred rites. But beneath these layers may lie a deeper essence, something unspoken yet universally understood by those who first inscribed it into stone. Standing today in front of these carvings, separated by millennia yet unsettled by the same shape, one cannot help but sense the pressure of a forgotten memory. It is as though the stone is waiting, holding something quiet and untranslatable. Every theory that attempts to explain the motif feels incomplete, like trying to reconstruct a map from isolated fragments. And perhaps that incompleteness reflects our own distance from the world that created these symbols, a world shaped by upheavals we barely understand, with horizons far wider than the ones we imagine. As the motif drifts through the early history of humanity, from Anatolia to Mesopotamia to the Americas, it leaves a trail not of answers but of questions. Questions that deepen the more we notice them. Why did a symbol so consistent appear among cultures with no known connection? Why did it arrive so suddenly and vanish so cleanly? And why does its presence feel so deliberate, as though pointing towards something just beyond reach? Perhaps hidden beneath layers of sediment and time, there lies a memory that refuses to die, a memory that surfaces in the form of a small carved handbag, waiting patiently for someone to recognize what it once meant. There is a moment, when looking at the earliest depictions of the mysterious handbag, where one begins to sense something unsettling. Not only its recurrence, but the way it seems to appear beside beings who do not quite resemble ordinary humans. At Göbekli Tepe, the tall T-shaped pillars bear carved arms and hands, yet no faces, as if the figures they represent existed half in this world, half in another. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu are rendered with wings, scales, or strange hybrid forms. In Mesoamerican art, the gods who hold the same peculiar object are depicted with features that blur the boundaries between human and divine. Across these regions, the motif clings stubbornly to figures connected with knowledge, transformation, or guardianship, and this connection raises a delicate question. Were these ancient societies attempting to represent something, or someone, whose nature they did not fully understand, but whose memory they felt compelled to preserve? The symbolic language of early civilizations often mingles the literal with the mythic. A being might be drawn with wings not because it had them, but because it symbolized a messenger, a traveler between realms, earth and sky, seen and unseen, sacred and mundane. Yet even when one allows for symbolic interpretation, the precision of the imagery remains difficult to ignore. The objects those beings hold are not abstract. They are not amorphous containers or vague bundles. They are rendered with straight edges, curved handles, and proportional consistency. They feel like depictions of something tangible, something remembered. And memory, once carved into stone, preserves not only belief but experience. Some archaeologists studying Göbekli Tepe have observed that the figures on the pillars seem deliberately stylized, stripped of facial features as though meant to represent a kind of archetype rather than an individual. Others suggest that the absence of faces might reflect a taboo, a prohibition against depicting certain beings too directly. In this context, the presence of the handbag becomes even more intriguing. If the figures were sacred, if they belonged to a realm of myth or ritual, then what did it mean for them to carry that object? Was it a badge of role, a symbol of authority, or a marker of a knowledge passed only to the initiated? The motif begins to feel less like a neutral artifact and more like an emblem, and emblems have a habit of outliving the cultures that create them, drifting into new contexts where their original meaning survives only in fragments. The puzzling consistency of the motif across continents has led some researchers to revisit the idea of ancient cultural diffusion, once dismissed, now cautiously reconsidered as new evidence reshapes the timeline of human migrations. Genetic studies have revealed that early hunter-gatherer groups moved farther and faster than previously believed, carrying both tools and stories across vast landscapes. Symbols, too, can travel, but the question remains, why this symbol, why not others? Why a container so precise in form, carried by beings associated with beginnings? The abrupt disappearance of the motif adds yet another layer of unease. When symbols fade, they usually leave echoes, simplified versions, distortions, reinterpretations. Yet the handbag vanishes almost completely after its early prominence. One moment it is everywhere, the next it is gone. Such a clean symbolic break suggests a rupture in memory, a discontinuity that interrupts the transmission of meaning. What event or sequence of events might have caused such a rupture? Some scholars point to the end of the Pleistocene, a time marked by dramatic environmental upheaval. As the Younger Dryas period drew to a close, melting glaciers reshaped entire continents. Sea levels rose hundreds of feet, flooding coastlines that had been home to unknown populations. If knowledge-bearing groups lived along these coasts, as many maritime archaeologists believe, then the loss of land would have meant the loss of cultures, stories, and symbols. What survived might have been scattered remnants, carried inland by survivors who preserved fragments of memory through ritual or myth. In this view, the handbag could be one of those fragments. Its true context washed away by rising seas, leaving only the outline of a forgotten tradition. The motif's relationship with cosmology is also difficult to dismiss. In many ancient cultures, containers symbolize the womb, the cosmos, or the vessel that holds primordial waters. The Egyptian hieroglyph for sky is a bowl-like shape. Sumerian texts describe the firmament as a dome resting above the world. If the builders of Göbekli Tepe encoded celestial knowledge into their carvings, as some archaeoastronomers suggest, then the bag could be an early representation of the ordered universe, held by figures who were seen as its keepers. But again, this interpretation only raises further questions. Why depict the cosmos as a portable object? Why emphasize the handle? Why render it with such physical solidity? There is a haunting possibility that emerges when considering all these threads, that the motif stood for something both literal and symbolic, something that bridged the practical and the sacred. Perhaps it represented a tool used in rituals, one containing seeds, pigments, stones, or substances whose significance we cannot guess. Or perhaps it symbolized the carrying of knowledge, the transmission of order from an older world to a new one. If the builders of Göbekli Tepe inherited memory from a people who witnessed catastrophe, then preserving that memory in stone may have been a way of honoring what was lost. But the motif's peculiar persistence across distant civilizations suggests more than simple inheritance. It suggests shared recall, a faint, widespread memory of something once central to human experience. Myths across the world speak of a time when knowledge was given, not discovered, when teachers appeared from elsewhere, when humanity received something precious that shaped its destiny. These stories are often dismissed as allegory, yet they echo with a strange consistency, like voices calling from within a fog that has obscured their origin. In one Mesoamerican carving, a deity stands with the bag held firmly in hand, facing another figure who seems to await instruction. The scene radiates quiet authority, as though depicting a transfer of responsibility. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu clutch the same object while performing gestures that resemble blessing or measurement. At Göbekli Tepe, the bags float above the animal world, perhaps signifying dominion, perhaps symbolizing the ordering of chaos. In each case, the motif is not merely present but central. It is placed where attention naturally falls, as though calling the viewer to ask what it once meant. And yet, despite the richness of these scenes, the object remains silent. Its meaning does not unfold easily. It persists like a symbol, deliberately stripped of context, as though the knowledge it once carried was never meant to be fully restored. There is an unsettling elegance in that silence, an invitation to wonder, but also a boundary we cannot cross. Standing at the edge of this boundary, one is left with a question that feels larger than archaeology, larger than myth. If humanity once knew something profound enough to be carved into stone across continents, then what force, what event, what shift in consciousness caused that knowledge to fracture and fade? And why does the symbol resurface only at the very beginning of our known history, as though marking a threshold we have not yet learned to understand? There is a certain strangeness in realizing that the deeper we trace this ancient motif, the more its edges seem to blur into the liminal space between memory and myth. The handbag of the gods, as it is sometimes called, does not sit neatly within any archaeological category. It is neither a clear ceremonial tool nor an identifiable container tied to daily life. Instead, it appears only where the sacred realm intrudes, where gods, sages, or beings of ambiguous origin interact with humanity in moments portrayed as foundational. This placement implies intention, as though the symbol itself occupied a threshold in the ancient imagination, marking moments of transition or transmission that shaped the early human world. In Mesopotamian reliefs, the Apkallu grasped the object with a posture that seems purposeful, almost reverent. Their other hands often hold a pine cone-like item, a symbol thought to represent purification or the scattering of sacred essence. Some scholars argue that the bag held seeds used in ritual fertilization rites, a symbolic gesture connecting the act of sowing to the creation of order. But this explanation falters when one considers the earliest depictions at Göbekli Tepe, long predating agriculture as we traditionally understand it. Why would a hunter-gatherer society carve such a container before the rise of farming? And why would later civilizations, those fluent in myth and ritual, use the same form to represent divine authority rather than agrarian life? This chronological inversion unsettles the assumption that agriculture gave rise to symbolism. Instead, it hints that symbolism, cosmological, conceptual, or inherited, may have preceded agriculture, guiding the shift rather than arising from it. If true, then the handbag becomes more than a relic of ritual practice. It becomes a vestige of an older symbolic grammar, one that influenced the shape of human civilization before the first fields were sown. Göbekli Tepe complicates the narrative further with its architecture. The site's enclosures appear to follow a design tradition that spanned generations. Each circular structure contains a pair of towering central pillars, surrounded by smaller ones arranged with geometric precision. Some researchers interpret this as a cosmic diagram, an attempt to mirror the structure of the sky on Earth. If the pillars were meant to embody beings or forces, then whatever they held must have had significance within this cosmological frame. The handbags etched above animal reliefs or placed near the arms of the towering figures suggest that the object carried a meaning integrated into the worldview, encoded in stone. The intentional burial of the site introduces another layer of mystery. It was preserved, not abandoned, sealed deliberately. Over centuries, the builders filled the enclosures with rubble, covering their work like someone closing the pages of a book not meant for future readers. If the handbag motif was part of this protected memory, then its disappearance after this period might hint at a rupture so profound that the symbol lost its relevance, or worse, became forbidden to reproduce. Cultural taboos have the power to erase even powerful symbols, especially if the stories associated with them are tied to events too painful or destabilizing to preserve. Across the world, myths often reference a time before the present order, a time of upheaval, loss, or transformation. The Sumerian flood story, the Mesoamerican tales of previous worlds, the Greek narratives of ages lost to cataclysm, all echo with the idea that humanity passed through a threshold where knowledge was broken and reassembled. These stories differ in detail but share an emotional resonance, the sense of a world reset, of memory fractured. If the handbag belonged to a tradition from before such resets, then its vanishing might mark the moment when humanity lost the continuity needed to interpret it. Yet while the meaning vanished, the shape endured. For reasons still unknown, the motif travelled across continents. This migration invites questions not only about cultural exchange, but about the mechanisms through which ideas persist outside written language. Oral traditions carry more than stories. They carry images, rituals, patterns of gesture, fragments of worldview. A symbol can survive stripped of its original meaning, simply because it feels important, familiar, resonant. The handbag could have been a mnemonic device, a visual anchor for concepts that no longer exist in their original form. In this sense, the motif may operate like a fossil of the mind, a preserved imprint of a thought that no longer breathes. Most fossils tell us little about the living creature beyond its outline. Perhaps symbols function similarly. They show shape, not essence. And the shape that recurs here is too precise, too stable to be accidental. It suggests a lineage of meaning that once travelled far, carried by those who moved across landscapes reshaped by ice, wind, and rising seas. Some researchers have noted that early human migrations were not as isolated as once believed. Recent genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that populations moved widely, sharing technologies and practices across regions long before civilizations formalized boundaries. If symbolic knowledge traveled with them, then the handbag could have been part of an ancient cultural vocabulary shared across dispersed groups. But why this particular symbol? What made it universal enough to take root in sites separated by oceans? This is where the conversations among scholars turn quiet, drifting into speculations seldom printed in academic work. Some suggest that the symbol might represent a tool essential to early spiritual practice, something once tangible but later ceremonial. Others argue it might have represented a bundle of concepts, cosmic order, cycles, or the structure of the world, signified visually through a container. Still others wonder whether the early human world was shaped by interactions or teachings, now remembered only through myth. Such suggestions tread the boundary between archaeology and the uncertain realm where memory becomes legend. And perhaps that is where the symbol truly lives, at the dividing line between the material and the mythic, the remembered and the forgotten. Its disappearance may mark a shift in human consciousness, a collective turning away from the worldview that created it. The rise of agriculture, writing, and structured religion may have introduced new symbolic systems that rendered older ones obsolete. In the process, the meaning of the handbag may have slipped into silence, surviving only as a formal echo replicated by hands that no longer understood what they carved. Yet even in its silence, the motif continues to provoke. It invites contemplation, urging us to consider what fragments of our earliest memory lie buried beneath layers of time and interpretation. Perhaps the object was once so fundamental, so widely understood, that explaining it would have been unnecessary. But when the continuity broke, the image remained without its story, like a shell left behind by a vanished creature. And so we are left with a shape, simple, consistent, persistent, an outline without explanation, a whisper without words. Standing before these carvings, one feels the weight of that silence, not merely the silence of unknown meaning, but the silence of something once vital, now obscured. It raises a quiet, lingering question. If this symbol survived long enough to cross continents before fading, what other memories might still lie hidden, carved into stone, buried beneath ancient soil, or drifting through the myths we no longer recognize as echoes of an older world? There is a peculiar sensation that emerges when one begins mapping the places where this mysterious motif appears. Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia, the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, the ceremonial centers of the Olmec and later Mesoamerican cultures. These locations form not a line nor a pattern, but something closer to a constellation, distant points connected only by the faint invisible threads of memory. And yet, despite all the geographical and chronological distance, the motif remains stable, as if resisting the erosion that devours so many ancient symbols. It is this stability, this refusal to morph into something else, that hints at a deeper coherence, a meaning once held in common by people separated by oceans and epochs. Historians often speak of symbolic drift, the natural process by which images evolve as they move across cultures. A lion becomes a dragon, a sun disk becomes a halo, a serpent becomes a river deity. But the handbag remains stubbornly fixed. Its proportions do not fluctuate wildly, its form does not deform into abstraction. Even when placed in vastly different mythological frameworks, the object looks essentially the same. This peculiar stability raises the unsettling possibility that the motif was not an invention of any single culture, but a memory inherited from a time deeper than our surviving histories can reach. In examining this idea, one is drawn inevitably toward the shadowed realm of cultural bottlenecks, moments when humanity passed through extreme stresses that erased much of its past. The end of the last ice age is one such moment. Sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, submerging coastlines that had been home to early human communities. Vast regions vanished beneath the waves, taking with them whatever knowledge or symbols had flourished there. Some archaeologists argue that if any early sophisticated coastal cultures existed, their remains now lie at depths largely unexplored. In this light, the handbag motif becomes something like a message in a bottle, a relic washed ashore from a world swallowed by rising seas. Consider the sediments of the Black Sea, where underwater surveys have revealed ancient shorelines far below the modern level. Or Doggerland, the now submerged landmass that once connected Britain to continental Europe, home to hunter-gatherer groups who left behind tools but few symbols. Across the globe, underwater archaeology is beginning to uncover hints of settlements older than expected, challenging the assumption that advanced symbolic traditions began only with settled agriculture. If early coastal societies transmitted knowledge inland during the floods, then their symbols could have survived in fragmentary form, carried by groups forced to migrate and adapt. The motif's association with beings linked to knowledge adds weight to this possibility. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu were remembered as wise sages who lived before a great flood. In Mesoamerica, deities like Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan were said to have instructed humanity in arts, laws, and calendars. In the Andes, Viracocha emerged after a devastating catastrophe to restore order. These stories, while clothed in mythological imagery, may preserve memories of real migrations, of groups who carried traditions across continents after environmental collapse. If such groups carried physical tools or objects essential to ritual, teaching, or measurement, depictions of those items might have persisted long after their original context faded. Still, one must tread carefully here. Memory is unreliable, especially across millennia. Myths encapsulate truth, but rarely in literal form. And yet it is difficult to ignore how consistently ancient cultures describe figures arriving from elsewhere, bearing objects that changed the course of human development. Whether these objects were metaphors or physical tools is impossible to determine, but the handbag motif may be one of the few surviving visual traces of this shared motif. There is also the question of what the object might have contained, or represented. Some suggest it held seeds, the literal promise of agriculture. Others propose it was a container for pigments or ritual substances, essential for early ceremonies. A few researchers point to the possibility that it represented a portable cosmic diagram, a condensed symbol of the structured universe. In many ancient traditions, the cosmos is conceptualized as something that can be held, measured, or divided. The Sumerians describe the world as built from ordered compartments. The Maya represented cosmology in bundled forms, tied and untied in ceremony. Tibetan rituals still use portable mandalas contained within bags or cases. Perhaps the earliest peoples used similar conceptual tools, and the bag served as a representation of that tradition. The problem is not that we lack hypotheses, it is that every hypothesis seems incomplete. Each one explains a fraction of the motif's presence, but none account for its global spread, its precise form, or its sudden disappearance. It is as if we are staring at the negative space of an idea, the outline of something that was once central, but whose substance has been lost. When standing before these ancient carvings, one is struck not by their age but by their immediacy. The stone feels alive, as if it were a surface upon which someone recently pressed their memory. The hands that carved those lines did so with intention, perhaps even reverence. There is no sense of experimentation in the form, only execution. This confidence suggests familiarity rather than invention, inheritance rather than innovation. And then the silence. After appearing repeatedly across the earliest sacred art, the motif fades with almost unnatural abruptness. It does not linger in symbolic mutations, it simply stops. This absence feels less like organic cultural drift and more like a horizon, one we cannot see beyond. Perhaps the symbol belonged to a worldview that dissolved as new forms of hierarchy, agriculture, and social order emerged. As civilizations formalized their cosmologies and rituals, older symbols may have been quietly retired, remembered only in fragmented myths. But absence can sometimes speak louder than presence. The vanishing of the motif raises a haunting question. Did humanity lose something fundamental, a way of understanding the world, a shared symbolic language, or a memory of origins that no longer fits within the narratives we tell about ourselves? The more one contemplates this possibility, the heavier the silence becomes. It stretches across continents, lying beneath layers of soil and history like a forgotten chord. When the same shape appears across distant cultures, we call it coincidence. When it does so at the very threshold of history, we call it mystery. But when it disappears before those cultures fully form, Leaving no clear descendants, what then do we call it? Perhaps the answer lies not in recovering the object's literal meaning, but in recognizing the void it illuminates. The handbag may be a marker of something lost, not the object itself, but the continuity of memory. A reminder that our earliest ancestors lived through worlds we cannot imagine, carrying with them symbols we inherited but no longer understand. And perhaps the question that lingers at the edge of every carved relief is not, what was this object, but something more fragile, more human. What did we forget? And who were we before forgetting began? There is a strange tension that arises when one considers not only where the handbag motif appears, but where it does not. It emerges suddenly at Göbekli Tepe, fully formed, carried with confidence by figures whose identities remain maddeningly ambiguous. It reappears in early Mesopotamian reliefs, placed in the hands of the Apkallu, beings linked to primordial knowledge. Then it surfaces again in Mesoamerica, far across an ocean, held by gods who shaped the world from maize, bone, and breath. But after these early appearances, after this brief, brilliant constellation of symbols, it fades as though a door quietly closed. The abruptness of this fading stands out like a missing chapter in a book, a silence not caused by erosion or neglect, but by something more deliberate. It is in this silence that researchers begin to sense the possibility of an unspoken rupture, a break in the continuity of memory. For if the motif carried the weight of meaning, why did no later cultures adapt it, reshape it, reinterpret it the way they did with other symbols? Why did it not evolve into new forms as myths changed and societies grew? Instead of transformation, there is disappearance, and disappearance can be more revealing than survival. One thread that may help unravel this mystery lies in the nature of early sacred spaces. Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement. There are no signs of domestic life, no hearths, no houses, no daily refuse. It appears to have been a place reserved for ritual, gathering, and perhaps instruction. The carvings, then, were not expressions of everyday life, but symbols of a worldview held by those who built and visited these stone circles. In this context, the handbag becomes something akin to a marker of participation in a sacred worldview, a shared emblem among groups who travelled great distances to gather there. The idea of Göbekli Tepe as a meeting point, a ceremonial nexus for multiple hunter-gatherer groups, is not new. Archaeologists have long suspected that the site functioned as a hub where people exchanged not only goods, but ideas, rituals, and symbolic traditions. If the motif originated within or around this nexus, it may have spread outward as groups carried fragments of its meaning back to their own territories. What we see in later civilizations could be echoes of this dissemination, reflections of a symbol whose essence was carried far from its birthplace, adapted into new mythologies but retaining its recognizable form. This raises another question. What forces could have fractured this symbolic lineage so thoroughly that its meaning evaporated? The shift to agriculture provides one possible answer. As humans transitioned into settled life, new concerns and cosmologies emerged. Hierarchies formed, writing systems developed, religions took shape around different forms of authority. Symbols associated with earlier, more communal worldviews may have lost their relevance, replaced by emblems that aligned more closely with the needs of stratified societies. A motif associated with an older order, one perhaps tied to shared knowledge rather than centralized power, may have been quietly retired. But the idea of quiet retirement does not feel entirely satisfying. There is a sharpness in the disappearance of the motif, a suddenness that suggests something more abrupt. It is here that the idea of cultural bottlenecks returns, not as environmental catastrophe this time, but as ideological transformation. When societies begin to formalize belief systems, they often exert pressure on the symbols that preceded them. Some are absorbed, reinterpreted, or overwritten. Others are suppressed, sometimes intentionally, sometimes simply ignored until they fade from memory. If the handbag represented concepts incompatible with the emerging structures of authority, knowledge shared rather than controlled, power distributed rather than centralized, its disappearance might reflect a shift in who had access to sacred understanding. In this sense, the motif may be less a relic of lost technology than a relic of lost worldview. A worldview in which knowledge was held collectively, symbolized through an object that could be carried by anyone initiated into its meaning. The comparison to the Egyptian ankh, the Mesopotamian rod and ring, or the Mesoamerican jaguar pelt is tempting, but none of these symbols match the handbag in form or distribution. Those symbols evolved. They fragmented, recombined, and gave birth to new imagery across centuries. They lived. The handbag, by contrast, feels like a fossil, unchanged, unmoving, preserved in its earliest state and then suddenly extinct. This fossil-like quality hints that its meaning may have been tied to a worldview so ancient and so foreign to later civilizations that no reinterpretation was possible. When that worldview vanished, the symbol could no longer be sustained. Some scholars studying Mesopotamian mythology note that the Apkallu, bearers of the motif, were said to belong to an earlier age, a time before the flood. After the flood, remaining Apkallu were said to be of human descent, no longer the hybrid or divine beings depicted in earlier art. This shift parallels the motif's disappearance. As the beings associated with it become mythologized rather than memorialized, the object loses context. It becomes a relic of a past deemed unreachable. In Mesoamerica, something similar occurs. Early depictions of gods holding the object appear in contexts linked to creation and cosmic ordering. But as later civilizations formalized their religious frameworks, the motif fades, overshadowed by new symbols representing authority, warfare, and state power. What remains are scattered echoes, objects held by deities whose stories hint at older layers beneath later narratives. The motif's role as a carrier of seeds, tools, or cosmic principles may offer another hint. In mythology, containers often symbolize potential, the capacity to transform, to create, to carry forward something precious. If the handbag embodied a concept of potential tied to early cosmology, then its disappearance might reflect a broader shift in how later societies understood beginnings. New gods, new myths, new structures of the universe replaced earlier ones, leaving little room for symbols tied to older cosmological frameworks. Yet despite all these lines of reasoning, the motif resists closure. It continues to stand outside the explanations offered for it, as if reminding us that our understanding of early human symbolism is still painfully incomplete. Archaeology excels at cataloguing material remains, but struggles with intangible forms of knowledge, ritual, myth, worldview. When symbols vanish, they leave behind outlines without content, shapes without stories. And perhaps the most haunting thing about the handbag is not what it was, but the void it reveals, the absence of the narrative that once surrounded it. For those who stare at these carvings under the dim lights of museums or the rising sun of Anatolian hillsides, the symbol begins to feel like a rupture in time, a mark of something once shared across vast distances now lost. The more one contemplates it, the more it feels less like an artifact and more like an echo. And echoes by nature hint at origins far beyond what we can hear. If the same motif could travel so far, carried by hands separated by oceans and millennia, then one cannot help but wonder about the unseen networks that once connected humanity. Not in the literal sense of trade routes or migrations, but in the deeper, more elusive sense of shared experience, an inheritance scattered before the dawn of history. And perhaps the lingering question is this: if such an object once represented a shared understanding of the world, what would it mean to rediscover that understanding now, in an age when so much has been forgotten that the past feels like a locked door waiting for the right memory to fit its keyhole? There is a moment when tracing the motif across its scattered appearances, where one begins to sense not merely continuity, but something akin to intention, an invisible thread linking cultures that should never have known of each other. Yet even as this thread becomes faintly perceptible, it resists any clear unravelling. Each time the handbag is examined, it seems to shift slightly, as though guarding the very meaning it once embodied. And perhaps that is the most revealing aspect of all. The motif behaves less like a simple image, and more like a boundary stone left at the edges of a lost landscape of thought. Its presence marks where an idea once stood, and its absence marks where that idea disappeared. At Göbekli Tepe, the handbag sits among animals, celestial shapes, and towering anthropomorphic pillars. Some researchers have likened the enclosures to a kind of stone library, its pillars functioning as pages containing encoded knowledge. But unlike written text, the symbols are not sequential. They do not follow a linear narrative. Instead, they seem arranged in clusters of meaning, like constellations in the sky, their significance emerging only through relationships. Within such a system, the handbag could be a glyph of extraordinary importance, a motif that anchored a broader cosmological structure invisible to us. If early humans at Göbekli Tepe encoded their worldview in symbols rather than words, then the disappearance of one symbol may reflect a shift in the very architecture of their understanding. Some archaeologists have pointed out that the earliest levels of Göbekli Tepe show signs of remarkable organization, communal labor, coordinated ritual practices, and a degree of social cohesion inconsistent with what is typically assumed for hunter-gatherer societies. This suggests that the people who carved those pillars shared more than survival strategies. They shared ideas, and ideas, once embodied in stone, tend to radiate outward. The handbag may have been one such idea, a portable symbol of order, balance, or transmission, something that signified not an object held but a principle carried. Yet even as its symbolic weight seems undeniable, the motif puzzles in another direction, the hands that hold it. The Apkallu of Mesopotamia, with their hybrid bodies and otherworldly presence, were not remembered as ordinary beings. They were said to have existed before the flood, an era of primordial knowledge. In later Babylonian texts, humans become the inheritors of the Apkallu's teachings, but their divine or semi-divine predecessors withdraw. In this shift, one sees the fading of a worldview in which knowledge was tied to beings who mediated between realms. Once those beings receded into myth, the objects associated with them may have lost their meaning. One cannot help noticing the parallel with Mesoamerican traditions, where gods who carried similar objects delivered rituals, calendars, and cosmic order before retreating from the human world. The fact that both traditions connect the motif with beings at the cusp of creation is unsettling in its symmetry. Myths from regions never in contact describe ages before the present one, ages of transformation, disruption, or rebirth. And in those liminal moments, moments when the cosmos was shaped, the handbag appears with an eerie consistency. Whether literal or symbolic, it seems tethered to the idea of beginnings. If this is so, then perhaps the disappearance of the motif marks the end of a worldview in which humanity saw itself as emerging from an older, more mysterious lineage. Later civilizations tended to anchor their origins in kings, gods, or ancestors within reach, constructs that support political and religious authority. A symbol tied to an earlier, more ambiguous heritage may have been incompatible with the needs of structured society. The rise of state religion often requires the pruning of symbolic trees whose branches stretch too far into forgotten realms. Another angle emerges when one examines the motif through the lens of early measurement systems. The object's shape is strikingly similar to early weights, baskets, and calibration tools found in ancient sites. Some scholars propose that the handbag may have represented a tool of standardization, a device connected to the measurement of grain, water, or cosmic cycles. If so, it may have been more than a ritual item. It may have been a symbol of the human attempt to impose order on the world. But again, the precision with which it appears across cultures complicates this interpretation. Measurement systems evolve rapidly. Symbols tied to practical tools do not remain unchanged for millennia. The motif's stability therefore suggests that even if it had practical origins, it became something superseding practicality, something woven into mythic memory. And mythic memory is notoriously difficult to reconstruct. It is layered, rewritten, and reinterpreted across generations. What survives is often the outer shell, while the inner meaning withers. The handbag may be such a shell, an empty vessel whose contents were poured out long ago, leaving only the container behind. There is another, quieter possibility, one rarely voiced in academic circles because it treads too close to speculation. Perhaps the motif represents not an object but a category, not something held but something bestowed, an initiation, a responsibility, a form of knowledge transmitted from one generation to the next. Ancient cultures often encoded intangible concepts in concrete images. Wisdom becomes a cup, life becomes a tree, authority becomes a staff. If the handbag represented an intangible gift or burden, something akin to guardianship of order, its disappearance might reflect a shift in how later societies conceived of wisdom itself. Such a shift may have come gradually, as human communities moved from fluid hunter-gatherer networks to rigid hierarchies. Knowledge that was once decentralized became monopolized by priestly castes, scribes, and rulers. In such a world, symbols of shared or distributed knowledge may have become obsolete, or even threatening. The motif's disappearance could reflect the dawn of a different kind of authority, one rooted not in inherited memory but in institutional power, and yet, even as the symbol vanished, its whisper remains. Among researchers and mythologists, the handbag has become a kind of ghost, a residue of something we cannot fully name. It evokes not the presence of knowledge, but the absence of it, a reminder that our species once lived within cosmologies that we can barely glimpse. When the same motif appears in places separated by oceans, it asks a question we struggle to frame. Was there something humanity once understood collectively before the stories diverged? Perhaps the symbol's true mystery lies not in what it meant to ancient peoples, but in what it reveals about us. The fact that we cannot reconstruct its meaning suggests a gap in our understanding of early human culture, a gap wide enough to hold entire worlds of forgotten thought. The motif may be a portal into that forgotten world, but the portal does not open. It only stands before us, carved in stone, hinting at a memory lost before memory was written down. And as one contemplates its quiet persistence and sudden extinction, a final question lingers like a thin strand of smoke. If this symbol marks the edge of a vanished worldview, then what lies on the other side of that boundary, waiting for a time when we might finally remember the stories we once carried and the truths we let slip into silence? There is a subtle shift that occurs when one begins to follow not the motif itself, but the context in which it appears. The handbag, after all, is never shown in isolation. It is always situated among symbols, beings, and gestures that imply a larger system of thought, one that seems familiar at first glance, yet dissolves into ambiguity the moment we try to grasp it. Perhaps this is why the motif remains so magnetic. It is less a clue than a crossroads, a point where multiple forgotten traditions briefly intersect before fading again into the obscurity of deep time. At Göbekli Tepe, the handbag floats above the heads of animals, foxes, lions, vultures, aurochs, and creatures whose exact species are still debated. The animals seem arranged with careful deliberation, as though composing a kind of coded bestiary. Some scholars propose that the animals represent star constellations or celestial events. If that is true, then the handbags placed above them might represent a kind of cosmic ordering, a container holding the relationships between sky and earth. But even this poetic interpretation feels incomplete. Why depict containers at all? Why not simply carve the animals and symbols directly into the pillars, as was done elsewhere on the site? One hypothesis suggests that the handbag might have served as a visual boundary, a frame marking the transition between the earthly realm, represented by animals, and some higher plane associated with the figures who carry the motif. It may have functioned like the baskets or satchels used by shamans in later cultures, containers for tools used to traverse realms or to induce states of altered consciousness. At Göbekli Tepe, there is evidence that rituals might have involved substances derived from plants or animals, possibly used to alter perception. If so, then the handbag could represent the vessel that carried these substances, an object essential to connecting the human world with something beyond. In Mesopotamia, similar associations appear. The Apkallu, depicted holding the handbag, were said to bridge the boundary between gods and humans. They taught kings and priests how to understand the hidden layers of reality. Their satchels may have been symbolic of their role as carriers of knowledge, repositories of the wisdom that shaped early civilization. Mesopotamian texts describe knowledge as something held, overturned, weighed, or poured. The imagery of carrying knowledge, of containing it, is woven through their religious and administrative vocabulary. In this linguistic context, the depiction of a container becomes less literal and more conceptual, a symbol of the ability to hold the cosmos in understanding, yet as compelling as these interpretations are, they fail to explain the motif's appearance in Mesoamerica, where deities such as the Olmec weeping gods or the Maya maze lords are shown holding objects identical in shape. Some scholars argue that Mesoamerican handbags were used to carry copal, seeds, or offerings. Others point out their association with creation myths in which deities shape the world through ordered acts of division and distribution. In these stories, containers often hold the substances of creation: maize dough, water, bone dust, sacred stones. The idea that the universe began from a bundle or basket is not unique to Mesoamerica. It appears in mythologies across the world. Perhaps the handbag is one of the earliest visual echoes of this idea. Still, the motif's precise geometry stands out. Its curved handle, squared body, and consistent proportions suggest a degree of standardization unusual for purely symbolic forms. This detail leads some researchers to propose that the object might have been real, a ritual satchel used by early shamans, priests, or astronomer sages. Such a tool could have persisted for thousands of years, carried across migrations and integrated into new cosmologies. But if the object was real, what happened to it? Why do no physical examples survive? Tools made from organic materials rarely endure long-term, but one would expect at least some trace, some buried fragment, some residue in graves or shrines. The absence of physical evidence complicates the notion of a literal tool, while simultaneously strengthening the idea of a metaphoric one. Perhaps the object was not carried in the hand, but carried in the mind, a symbol encapsulating concepts too abstract for early language to express. In this sense, the handbag may represent an early cognitive schema, a container for thought, a way of organizing perception. Some cognitive scientists studying ancient symbolism have proposed that early humans used container metaphors to describe complex ideas: knowledge, time, being, origin. The handbag could thus be humanity's first attempt at visually articulating an internal abstraction. This interpretation resonates with the motif's disappearance. If later societies developed more sophisticated linguistic and symbolic systems, older metaphors may have become obsolete. Concepts once embodied visually could have been absorbed into language or ritual without the need for physical representation. The disappearance of the handbag might therefore reflect an evolution in human cognition, a shift from visual metaphors to verbal ones, from carved stone to spoken theology. In this sense, the object's extinction marks not a cultural collapse but a transformation. Yet one cannot ignore the emotional charge surrounding the motif. Those who encounter it in person often describe a feeling of recognition, a sense that the image is familiar, even though its meaning remains elusive. This paradox mirrors something deep in the human psyche, the tension between memory and forgetting. We inherit symbols whose origins lie far beyond our historical horizon, carrying them forward even after their meaning dissolves. The handbag may be one such inheritance, a fragment of a worldview that our species once held collectively, long before it fractured into thousands of local traditions. The motif's placement above animals in Göbekli Tepe reinforces this possibility. If the animals correspond to constellations, then the handbag may symbolize the ordering principle that binds them, the early human attempt to map meaning onto the sky. In this reading, the object is not a bag but a horizon, a boundary, a container for the cosmos. The curved handle may represent the arc of the sky itself, while the square body symbolizes the structured world below. If so, then the image becomes not a depiction of a tool, but a diagram, a portable cosmos held by beings who mediate between realms. This idea, too, is mirrored in Mesoamerican cosmology, where gods carry bundles representing the layered universe, heavens above, earth below, the underworld beneath. In these traditions, the gods literally hold the cosmos in their hands, and in Mesopotamia, divine beings manipulate tablets, rods, rings, and measuring strings, instruments that shape the boundaries of the world. The handbag fits comfortably within this symbolic architecture, an emblem of cosmic stewardship. And yet the question remains, why this shape? Why a form so concrete, so earthly, so functional? Why not depict a disk, a sphere, a flame, or a star? Symbols more intuitively linked to cosmic order. The answer may lie in the origins of human cognition. Containers were among the first tools humans invented. They allowed our ancestors to gather, transport, preserve, and share. They represented survival, stability, continuity. It is natural, then, that early humans would use the metaphor of a container to describe the structure of existence. The universe itself becomes a vessel holding all things. Life becomes something carried, knowledge becomes something stored. Perhaps this is why the handbag endures across the earliest sacred art. It was a metaphor that made sense before language had the means to express such abstractions. A symbol so intuitive that it could be understood across cultures without words. And perhaps its disappearance marks the moment when humanity stepped beyond that early metaphor into more complex modes of thought, leaving behind the carved image but carrying the concept forward in ways we no longer recognize. Still, the symbol lingers, quiet and persistent like a forgotten chord in the human imagination. And the question it raises, what did we once understand so clearly that we no longer need the image at all, hangs between the stones of Göbekli Tepe and the pyramids of Mesoamerica like a breath held across time. There comes a point in studying this enigmatic motif when the question shifts from what it meant to why it mattered. Because clearly, it did matter. It mattered enough to be carved into megaliths in the world's first known ceremonial centre. It mattered enough to be held by beings of knowledge and authority in the earliest literate civilization. It mattered enough to appear again across an ocean, in a hemisphere that should have been culturally sealed from the old world. And then, after this quiet but monumental resonance, it faded. Almost as if its presence was permitted only during a certain phase of humanity's story. To ask why is to step into a realm of uncertainty that both archaeology and mythology circle warily. One way to approach this puzzle is to examine the role of containers in early symbolic cognition. Long before writing emerged, humans encoded meaning in forms, shapes, and objects. Bowls, baskets, and bags appear in Paleolithic art as symbols of nourishment, protection, and preservation. Some anthropologists argue that the mental model of the container is one of the cognitive foundations of human thought. We place memories inside, we carry futures within, we hold the unknown in bounded spaces. The handbag could thus be a primordial metaphor, one so ancient it predates distinctions between myth and reality. But even if this cognitive metaphor explains the symbol's intuitive power, it does not explain its sudden withdrawal from the archaeological record. Göbekli Tepe complicates everything further. Its symbolic repertoire is rich. Predator animals, headless bodies, celestial alignments, abstract glyphs that feel like fragments of a larger lexicon. The handbag is not the most numerous motif, yet it is one of the most deliberate. Placing it above animals, as if overseeing them, suggests hierarchy, order, or cosmological relationships. The animals themselves may encode seasonal cycles or star groups. If that is true, then the handbags could signify a governing principle, a cosmological container holding the structure that organizes the sky. Imagine early astronomer priests watching the slow procession of the heavens, noting shifts in constellations, cycles of precession, the patterns of movements that take thousands of years to reveal themselves. The people at Göbekli Tepe lived near the end of the Younger Dryas, a time of dramatic climatic upheaval. They would have been acutely aware of environmental instability. Mapping the sky may have been a way of making sense of a world that felt unpredictable. The handbag, in this context, might have symbolized the stability underlying cosmic change, the container of order behind apparent chaos. But even this graceful explanation cannot fully encompass its later appearances. The Apkallu of Mesopotamia, those civilizing sages, often carry the handbag as they purify trees, bless kings, or measure spaces. Their actions are ritualistic but also technical. They seem to restore order, impose structure, re-establish balance. In the Enumath Elish, the gods organize the cosmos by dividing, assigning, measuring. Perhaps the handbag, though not explicitly described in texts, was understood as a symbol of the knowledge that makes order possible, the blueprint of creation. And yet why would the same symbol appear in Mesoamerica, where cosmology developed independently? The Olmec and later the Maya and Aztecs used bundles, sacks, and pouches to represent sacred origins. The Maya even had a concept known as Kuhulbot, the holy bundle, containing the objects that founded kingdoms, rituals, and cosmic order. These bundles were treated as living entities, repositories of divine power. Some were passed down through dynasties, guarded in temples, and carried into battle as embodiments of legitimacy. In this context, the handbag could be seen as the visual ancestor of these holy bundles, different in cultural specifics but anchored in the same ancient metaphor. This raises a powerful possibility. The motif may represent the earliest container of sacred authority, the predecessor of tablets, scrolls, bundles, reliquaries, and ritual chests. Before written records existed, knowledge may have been preserved in portable collections. Objects, tools, symbols passed between initiates. Over time, as societies grew complex, these items evolved into written texts or priestly regalia. The original container faded as new vessels for knowledge emerged. There is another layer rarely considered but deeply provocative. The handbag might symbolize not what was carried, but the act of carrying itself. In many ancient narratives, founders of civilizations arrive bearing something: seeds of agriculture, fire, calendar knowledge, laws, rituals. The imagery of a being carrying a container may have served as shorthand for this archetype of transmission. If this archetype was shared across early Eurasian and American cultures, then the motif's presence signals a memory of cultural inheritance older than written history. But then comes the abrupt silence after the earliest periods. Why would such a foundational symbol vanish? One explanation is conceptual evolution. As societies developed specialized priesthoods, scribal classes, and centralized state power, knowledge became increasingly institutionalized. Instead of being carried across landscapes by roaming sages or visionaries, knowledge was stored in fixed places: temples, archives, monuments. The metaphor of the portable container may have lost relevance. The world no longer needed a symbol for knowledge that travels, it needed symbols for knowledge that endures. Another explanation is more troubling. Perhaps the motif belonged to a worldview incompatible with the rising ideologies of later civilizations. State religions, agricultural hierarchies, and emerging empires required symbols that reinforced authority, not shared inheritance. They needed symbols that justified power rather than decentralized it. If the handbag represented a previous order, egalitarian, shamanic, cosmologically fluid, it may have been quietly sidelined, not erased through violence, but abandoned through neglect. And yet, the possibility remains that the motif vanished not because it lost importance, but because the memory of what it signified was severed. The end of the last ice age, cultural bottlenecks, migrations, and the birth of new civilizations all imposed fractures on collective memory. If the symbol embodied concepts from a pre-flood or pre-agricultural age, then its disappearance might mark a profound forgetting, one that reshaped how humanity perceived its own origins. Archaeologists often describe the deep past as a horizon, a boundary beyond which our certainty dissolves. The handbag sits right at that horizon. It is one of the last coherent images before the fog of prehistory thickens. It gestures backward, towards something we once knew but cannot articulate, and forward towards civilizations that inherited fragments without understanding their source. And so, the image lingers, a small, simple container carried by beings who stand at the threshold between myth and memory. Its shape is modest, almost ordinary. But this ordinariness may be precisely why it endured. It offered a form flexible enough to carry meanings now lost. As one contemplates its presence across continents and its disappearance thereafter, a quiet thought begins to emerge, one that refuses to settle. What happens to a symbol when its meaning is no longer understood? Does it fade naturally, or does it deliberately retreat, waiting for a time when humanity becomes capable of remembering what it once carried? It may be that the handbag is not a riddle to be solved, but a reminder, an echo of something we once held collectively, a fragment of an inheritance we let slip from our grasp as the world changed around us. There is a quiet irony hidden within this ancient motif. The handbag, so small and unassuming in appearance, has become one of the most expansive enigmas in the study of early human symbolism. Its size is modest, but the conceptual territory it occupies is immense, and as one follows the motif deeper into the archaeological and mythological record, a strange pattern begins to emerge, not just of where the symbol appears, but of the moments it chooses to appear in. Always at thresholds, always at beginnings, always at points where humanity seems to take a step into a new way of understanding the world. This consistent placement suggests that the motif is not merely decorative, but is instead woven into the story of human emergence and transformation. At Göbekli Tepe, often described as the world's first monumental ritual center, the handbag appears at a pivotal time. the moment when groups of hunter-gatherers began to experiment with long-term gatherings, structured rituals, and forms of communal identity that transcended individual bands. These gatherings, facilitated perhaps by feasts, ceremonies, or celestial observations, may have laid the psychological groundwork for later agriculture. In this transitional context, the handbag seems almost like a symbol of coordination, something carried between groups, shared across vast territories, marking a continuity of purpose. If Göbekli Tepe was indeed a place where ideas were exchanged, the handbag might represent the portable knowledge that these groups carried with them as they dispersed across the region. Its appearance here, at the cusp of monumental architecture, situates it within a broader process, the crystallization of shared symbolic language. And once a symbol becomes embedded in a collective worldview, it has the potential to travel far, outlasting the site where it first appears. This brings us to Mesopotamia, where the symbol resurfaces in an entirely different context. The emergence of written language, urban life, monumental religion, and state power. Here, the handbag is not associated with communal gatherings, but with beings who mediate between the divine and the human. The Apkallu carry it with the same careful posture seen in the Göbekli Tepe carvings, but now it is part of a ritual grammar, an established visual vocabulary within a literate culture. This shift suggests that the symbol had already acquired layers of meaning by the time it reached Mesopotamia. And yet, even in this highly organized society, the motif remains tied to beginnings, the dawn of kingship, the establishment of agriculture, the organization of the cosmos after primordial chaos. The Apkallu are said to have lived before the flood, teaching humanity how to build, plant, write, and govern. Their handbags, therefore, are associated not simply with knowledge, but with the foundational knowledge upon which civilization itself rests. But it is the appearance of the motif in Mesoamerica that pushes the mystery into deeper waters. The Olmec civilization, one of the earliest in the Americas, crafted figures holding the exact same shape: straight-sided body, arched handle, balanced proportions. If one compares the reliefs of Göbekli Tepe, the Apkallu carvings, and the Olmec sculptures side by side, the resemblance is beyond casual similarity. And yet, there is no evidence, according to current mainstream archaeology, that Old World and New World cultures had any contact during this period. This disconnect has led some researchers to propose that the motif belongs to a much older cognitive layer, one laid down long before continents and cultures diverged. In other words, the symbol may originate not from migration, but from memory, something embedded so deeply in early human consciousness that it survived even as populations scattered across the globe. But what kind of memory could endure such separation? Here the conversation turns toward the idea of cultural deep time, a period before agriculture, before writing, before recognizable civilization, a time when humans lived in flexible, semi-nomadic groups that communicated across wide regions and shared stories that encoded collective experiences of cosmological, environmental, or existential significance. In this early world, a symbol could spread not through empire but through kinship networks, seasonal gatherings, or the slow, steady rhythm of oral tradition. If the handbag belongs to this deep symbolic layer, then its disappearance may reflect more than the end of a motif. It may mark the moment when humanity lost access to part of its deepest shared memory. But to understand why the symbol vanished, one must also consider how symbols live. They survive not because they are carved into stone, but because they remain meaningful. As soon as a symbol ceases to convey understanding, when the worldview that shaped it dissolves, the symbol falls dormant. It becomes empty, hollow, a container of nothing. Perhaps the handbag is exactly that, a container whose contents were forgotten so thoroughly that later societies no longer found it useful. In the wake of agricultural revolutions, stratification, literacy, and state religion, human consciousness changed. The cosmos was rearranged into hierarchies. Gods became rulers. Kings became the center of symbolic life. The shamanic worldview, fluid, interconnected, cyclical, gave way to a more rigid cosmology. A symbol representing portable, distributed, or collective knowledge might have lost relevance in a world that increasingly centralized power in temples, priesthoods, and royal courts. This raises a provocative question. What if the handbag was tied to a worldview fundamentally incompatible with the systems that later defined civilization? Not a worldview of control, but of connection. Not of hierarchy, but of shared cosmological responsibility. In such a worldview, knowledge would not be the property of a class, but something carried among the people, preserved in ritual bundles, shared in seasonal gatherings, held in memory rather than texts. When these forms of social organization declined, the symbol may have faded with them, but the motif's disappearance may also reflect something more existential, the gradual fragmentation of ancient mythic memory, myths of creation, of ancestral beings, of primordial teachers, often belong to the earliest layers of storytelling. As societies grew, new myths arose, myths tied to kings, wars, laws, and temples. The older stories receded into the margins, preserved only in fragments or reinterpreted through later religious lenses. What survives today are the faint archaeological traces, carvings on limestone, reliefs on palace walls, figures moulded in ancient clay. And in these traces the handbag remains, not explained, not contextualized, but suspended like a single syllable from a forgotten language. It is at this point that contemplation shifts from archaeology to introspection. Symbols, after all, are mirrors. They reflect the consciousness that created them. And the handbag may reflect a consciousness unlike our own, one that perceived the world not through boundaries but through flows, not as a hierarchy but as a tapestry. Standing before these ancient carvings, one is struck by a peculiar sensation, the feeling that the symbol is familiar even though its meaning is lost, as though some dormant part of the mind recognizes it. This sense of recognition may not be evidence of memory, but it is evidence of humanity's desire to remember, to recover the parts of itself that history, time, and transformation have obscured. And so the motif lingers at the edge of understanding, a quiet prompt from the deep past inviting us to consider what humanity once carried, what it held in its earliest symbolic containers, and what, somewhere along the long arc of time, it lets slip through its fingers without noticing. There is a point, somewhere between curiosity and resignation, where one realizes that the mystery of the handbag motif is not merely a question of archaeology or symbolism, it is a question of memory. Not the memory of individuals, but the memory of a species. Because what haunts this motif is not simply that we do not know what it meant, but that it seems deliberately placed at the threshold of everything we think we know. It greets us at the dawn of monumental architecture, at the emergence of literate cities, and at the rise of cosmological myth. And then, without warning, it steps back into the shadows. It is as if the symbol stands guard over a door we cannot open, a door that once led to an older understanding of the world. To grasp this possibility, one must consider the conditions under which early symbols arose. In the millennia before agriculture reshaped society, human groups lived in fluid, highly adaptive networks. Their survival depended not only on practical skills, but on their ability to interpret landscapes, animals, seasons, and the sky. Ritual, myth, and symbol were not separate from daily life. They were woven directly into it. Understanding the world demanded an intuitive, holistic worldview, one in which boundaries between the seen and unseen were permeable. In such a world, a single symbol could carry layers of meaning, cosmological, ritualistic, practical, emotional. The handbag may have been one such layered symbol, a vessel whose meaning shifted fluidly depending on who held it and why. But as societies became more structured, meaning began to crystallize. Where once symbols had multiple functions, later cultures demanded precision. Gods governed specific realms, rituals followed prescribed patterns, knowledge was categorized and stored. This shift, while beneficial for administration and long-term stability, may have cost us the richness of earlier symbolic frameworks. The ambiguity of the handbag becomes not a flaw in the past, but a reflection of how much more fluid early thought once was. Some researchers who study comparative mythology argue that many of humanity's earliest stories revolve around the idea of gifts from elsewhere, not necessarily from distant lands, but from distant states of being. Fire, seeds, language, music, and rituals often appear in myth as items bestowed by gods, ancestors, or culture heroes. These gifts are almost always portrayed as containers of transformation, tools that alter the trajectory of humanity. In these narratives, the container becomes a metaphor for potential. It holds the capacity for change that is released into the world through ritual use or sacred instruction. This metaphor may help illuminate the handbag motif's appearances. The Apkallu carry it when teaching kings how to rule. Mesoamerican gods hold it when shaping the world or transforming substances into life. At Göbekli Tepe, the bags float above animals that may represent constellations or cosmological categories. In each context, the motif appears at a moment of transition, a moment when something is being carried from one state to another, from the divine to the earthly, from chaos to order. If the motif indeed represents the concept of transformation or transmission, then its disappearance becomes easier to understand. Once societies institutionalize these transitions through formal religious structures, the need for the old container metaphor dissolved. The symbol had completed its work. It was replaced by more elaborate iconographies, tablets, scrolls, scepters, staffs, crowns, symbols aligned not with shared memory but with institutional authority. And yet there remains a deeper question, one that approaches the boundary between archaeological speculation and philosophical reflection. How much of the motif's disappearance is due to cultural evolution, and how much is due to a rupture in humanity's continuity of memory? This rupture is visible across myth traditions. Nearly every ancient culture preserves stories of a break in the world, a flood, a fire, a darkness, a resetting of time. These stories vary in detail but share the emotional core of loss of knowledge, loss of connection, loss of understanding. The Sumerian flood, the Mesoamerican 5 suns, the Vedic cycles of destruction, the Greek ages of man, all point to a belief that humanity's current world is not the first, but one in a succession of worlds, each separated by forgetting. What if the handbag belonged to a symbolic system from before the last rupture? A system that once structured how humans saw the world, but which became impossible to maintain once societies fragmented and restructured after climatic or cultural upheavals. If so, its meaning would not simply have faded. It would have become inaccessible because the conceptual framework needed to understand it no longer existed. Consider, for instance, the possibility that the motif represented a way of organizing experience, a cognitive tool. Early shamans, astronomer priests or myth keepers may have used containers symbolically to categorize knowledge, plants, stars, rituals, seasons, dreams. Such symbolic categorization is common across indigenous cultures even today, where baskets, bundles, or pouches hold not only physical objects but conceptual ones. Stories, spiritual responsibilities, social roles. If the handbag symbolized this kind of conceptual bundle, then its disappearance may signal a shift from oral, relational knowledge to textual, fixed knowledge. Another path of interpretation lies in the role of ritual bundles, still used in many cultures around the world. These bundles often contain objects that embody the identity of a lineage, a community, or a mythic ancestor. Their contents are rarely revealed. They are sacred not because of what they contain, but because they serve as vessels of continuity. The handbag may have been the earliest visual representation of such a vessel, something not meant to be opened literally or symbolically, but meant to hold the unbroken thread of tradition. This possibility casts its disappearance in a more poignant light. When lineages break, when migrations scatter communities, when oral traditions fade, ritual bundles lose their function. Without the stories that give them meaning, they become mere objects. Symbols behave the same way. Once disconnected from their narrative webs, they fall silent. In this sense, the handbag may be the silent witness of a forgotten world, a world in which humans perceive themselves not as separate units, but as participants in a shared cosmic order. Its form may have been a reminder that the world itself is carried, that life is held, that knowledge is a responsibility rather than a possession. Standing before the ancient carvings today, one can almost feel the presence of that older worldview. The stone does not tell us what the symbol meant, but the care with which it was shaped hints at reverence. It suggests that the object, real or imagined, held significance that transcended time, place, and culture, and it leaves behind a question that grows heavier with each attempt to answer it. If this symbol once held the key to understanding our earliest relationships with the cosmos, what does it say about us that its meaning has been lost? What does it reveal about the fractures in our cultural memory? And what hints might still lie buried in the motifs we overlook, waiting for the moment when we are quiet enough to hear their faint echoes once again? There are moments when tracing the faint outlines of this ancient symbol across continents, when one begins to suspect that the mystery of the handbag persists, not because it is unclear, but because it was never meant to be isolated from the worldview that once sustained it. Symbols do not live alone, they breathe within constellations of meaning. Remove them from that constellation, and they become like stars pulled from their sky, bright but incomprehensible. The handbag feels like such a star, luminous in its recurrence, but stripped of the mythic firmament that once gave it purpose. And as we study it in the modern era, disconnected from ritual, from oral memory, from cosmology, we can glimpse only its shadow, not its shape. This becomes especially evident when one examines how early cultures conceived of the boundary between the human world and the unseen. For many ancient societies, the cosmos was not divided into neat layers but braided into a continuum. Humans, animals, spirits, ancestors, and celestial beings inhabited overlapping spheres. Ritual specialists, shamans, priests, sages, acted as mediators, carrying knowledge between these realms. In such a worldview, a container carried by these mediators was not simply a pouch for objects, but a vessel for passage, transformation, or revelation. Its form was not separable from its function. When viewed through this lens, the placement of the handbag in Göbekli Tepe becomes even more evocative. There, the motif hovers above animals that may represent categories of being: predators, scavengers, celestial birds, mythic hybrids. These animals are not merely creatures, they are conceptual anchors, markers of roles in a cosmological map. The handbags placed above them may signify containment of these forces, an early attempt to diagram the way the cosmos is organized and held together. This interpretation aligns with the idea that early monumental art may have served as memory aids, encoding stories and principles that guided communal life. But what makes the motif so haunting is that we cannot tell whether it symbolized containment of knowledge, access to knowledge, or the responsibility of carrying knowledge forward. Each possibility changes the narrative, and each remains equally plausible. The ambiguity itself may reflect a worldview that did not distinguish sharply between object and idea, where tangible vessels were metaphors for intangible truths. This ambiguity extends into Mesopotamia, where the object appears in the hands of figures tasked with maintaining cosmic and earthly order. The Apkallu were attributed with preserving the balance between humanity and the divine. When they carried this object, the act was not incidental. It was a sign of their role as intermediaries, and in Mesopotamian cosmology, the maintenance of order was an ongoing delicate task. The world was not static. It required constant renewal through ritual. The handbag may have represented the tools or the principles of that renewal. Scholars sometimes suggest that the object might have contained ritual implements used in purification ceremonies, but this explanation feels too literal, too narrow to account for the symbol's deep resonance across cultures. Even if the object was real, its depiction in art likely transcended its practical function. After all, no one carves a tool into sacred stone unless it has been mythologized. In Mesoamerica, the container takes on yet another layer of meaning. Gods who shape worlds, measure time, and bring forth maize are shown holding similar objects. These gods do not merely act, they carry. The act of carrying is central to their identity. In many Mesoamerican traditions, creation itself begins with a bundle, a wrapped set of sacred items that anchors the cosmos. These bundles were guarded, revered, and renewed through generations. Their contents were understood not as objects but as embodiments of primordial events. If the handbag is indeed an ancestral version of the sacred bundle, then its presence across continents reveals something profound, a shared conceptual ancestry, not necessarily through contact, but through the deep architecture of human cognition. It suggests that early humans everywhere grappled with the same existential questions. What holds the world together? How is knowledge carried forward? What must be preserved through cycles of destruction and renewal? And arrived at similar metaphorical answers. Yet this metaphor, powerful as it may have been, eventually receded, and the reasons for its disappearance may lie not in the symbol itself, but in the transformation of human society. As agriculture solidified, writing emerged, and urbanization took hold, the mediatory role of ritual specialists shifted. Knowledge became codified in texts rather than carried through ritual memory. Authority became centralized. The cosmos hardened into a vertical hierarchy. In this new order, the old symbols lost their flexibility. The container metaphor may have felt too open, too communal, too tied to a world in which wisdom was fluid rather than institutional. What survived instead were symbols of control: the rod and ring, the scepter, the crown, the staff. These were not vessels. They were lines of authority. They pointed outward rather than inward. They signified ownership rather than stewardship. The worldview that once gave rise to the handbag dissolved into one where the cosmos was no longer carried, but ruled. And yet, the motif's sudden disappearance still feels uncomfortably abrupt. It does not fade gradually into lesser forms. It simply stops. Perhaps this abruptness reflects a rupture more severe than cultural evolution. Climate upheaval, ecological stress, population dispersal, or ideological realignment could have fractured the continuity of symbolic transmission. If the handbag was tied to a pre-agricultural or early agricultural worldview, one anchored in mobility, fluid cosmology, and collective memory, then its meaning may have become inaccessible as soon as the social fabric that supported it changed. The motif's extinction mirrors the extinction of so many early symbolic systems. Carved signs at Göbekli Tepe have no clear descendants. The earliest ritual practices leave behind echoes but no explanations. Oral traditions cannot leap across millennia without being remade. The handbag may be simply another relic of this vanished symbolic ecosystem, one we can observe but not inhabit. And yet there is an undeniable comfort in tracing its faint outlines. In doing so, one senses the contours of a worldview that feels strangely familiar despite being impossibly distant. A worldview in which humans saw themselves as part of a woven cosmos, one that required maintenance, care, and memory. A cosmos that was not owned, but carried. Perhaps this is why the motif continues to captivate. Not because we hope to solve it, but because it reminds us of something we have forgotten, that knowledge was once a sacred burden, held carefully and passed gently from one generation to the next. A burden light enough to carry in the hand, yet heavy enough to shape the destiny of a people. And so, the handbag, preserved only in carved stone, lingers like a quiet echo of humanity's earliest attempts to hold the world together, an echo inviting us to wonder what we once carried and what we may have set down too soon. There is an almost imperceptible shift that occurs when one studies the handbag motif long enough, not in the stone or in the scholarship, but in oneself. At first, the symbol provokes curiosity, then fascination, then a quiet kind of bewilderment. But eventually, as the pattern widens and the echoes multiply, something else begins to take shape. The sense that the motif points not backward into prehistory alone, but inward, toward the strange architecture of human meaning-making itself. Because to encounter the same form carved into pillars in prehistoric Anatolia, held by sages in Mesopotamia, and grasped by gods in ancient Mesoamerica, is to brush against the possibility that early humans shared not only tools or techniques, but ways of thinking, cognitive landscapes that drifted apart only later, leaving fragments behind like footprints in soft earth. And perhaps the handbag is one such footprint, or perhaps it is the impression of a footprint, an absence that hints at a vanished presence. Because the more carefully one traces the motif, the more it becomes clear that the symbol does not merely appear at the dawn of various civilizations. It appears at the thresholds of major conceptual shifts. It marks the crossing over from foraging to ritual, from ritual to cosmology, from cosmology to kingship. In each case, the motif emerges not as an explanatory diagram, but as a marker of something being carried forward. But what was being carried? To approach this question, one must consider the symbolic ecosystems of early humanity. Before writing existed, meaning was transmitted through image, gesture, and embodied practice. Symbols were not icons, but living participants in communal memory. They were carried into dance, carved into stone, whispered into stories, worn in ritual garments. Their meaning was not static, but relational, emerging from the interplay between people, places, and the cosmos. In many early societies, knowledge was not centralized. It was scattered, dispersed, woven into seasonal cycles and landscapes. Understanding the world meant understanding its layers: sky, water, soil, animal, ancestor, dream. A single symbol could serve as a bridge between these layers. The handbag may have been such a bridge, a vessel not of physical objects but of relationships, principles, or ways of perceiving. Some anthropologists propose that early containers were the first technology of abstraction. Before storage vessels, food had to be consumed or abandoned. Before conceptual containers, ideas had to be lived or lost. A container extended agency across time. It allowed something gathered in one moment to be used in another. This simple innovation may have reshaped human cognition, enabling planning, ritualization, and symbolic thought. If the handbag represents the container as concept, the holding of the world, the carrying of the unseen, its cross-cultural presence becomes easier to understand. Yet the motif is too specific, too deliberate, too consistently placed in sacred context to be simply a metaphor for storage. It appears not in scenes of everyday life, but in scenes of mythic or cosmological significance. The beings who hold it are not hunters, farmers, or artisans, but figures who mediate between realms: gods, sages, civilizers. This suggests that the container held something of greater consequence, something tied to the organization of the cosmos itself. In many myth traditions, the act of creation involves separation: light from darkness, water from land, sky from earth. These divisions are often depicted through gestures of holding, carrying, or placing. The creator figure navigates chaos, gathers its elements, and arranges them. The container in such narratives becomes a microcosm, a portable universe. The handbag, with its curved top and squared base, could be an early rendition of this conceptual tool, a depiction of the cosmos carried from chaos into order. But if it symbolizes the cosmos, why depict it as something that can be held so easily in the hand? Perhaps because early cosmologies did not distinguish between the vast and the intimate. The universe was not imagined as external, but as infused into daily life. To carry a container of seeds was to carry potential worlds. To transport a ritual bundle was to carry the identity of a lineage. To hold a vessel of pigments was to hold the power to reshape reality through image or ceremony. In this view, the handbag becomes the earliest articulation of a profound truth, that the cosmos lives inside the acts we perform, the objects we hold, the stories we tell. Still, the puzzle remains. Why did this symbol vanish so abruptly after its early fluorescence? Why does no later civilization in the Old World or the New World continue to depict it once their classical or imperial periods begin? One explanation lies in the transition from relational cosmologies to hierarchical ones. Early societies tended to view power as dispersed, a property of relationships, not individuals. But as cities grew, authority crystallized around kings, priests, and institutions. Symbols shifted accordingly. Power was now represented through staffs, rods, crowns, thrones, objects that did not carry the cosmos but ruled it. The subtle, inward-facing metaphor of carrying knowledge gave way to the external assertion of controlling knowledge. In such a world, the old symbol may have felt inadequate or even subversive. Another explanation lies in the loss of cultural continuity following catastrophic events. The end of the Younger Dryas, the flooding of coastlines, the collapse of certain regional populations, all could have fractured the transmission of symbolic memory. If the handbag belonged to a symbolic system from a pre-flood or pre-urban era, its disappearance may signal a rupture so deep that the cognitive frameworks supporting its meaning were irretrievably lost. But there is a third possibility, one that is more subtle, more philosophical. Perhaps the motif vanished because its role was fulfilled. Some symbols arise not to endure but to guide a transition. Once the transition is complete, the symbol dissolves. If the handbag represented the act of carrying knowledge from one era of humanity to the next, from a world shaped by survival to a world shaped by meaning, then its disappearance may reflect the moment when that burden shifted from symbol to structure. When writing, ritual architecture, and institutional memory took over, the container was no longer needed. The world began to hold itself. Yet the symbol's absence in later art does not diminish its presence in the deep substrata of human imagination. People who encounter it today often describe a sense of recognition, not intellectual, but intuitive, as though the symbol touches something ancient inside us, a faint echo of a worldview that is no longer accessible through language, but still flickers beneath the surface of our consciousness. In this way, the handbag becomes less a riddle and more a mirror, a reflection of a time when humanity carried its cosmos in its hands, a reminder that the earlier symbols did not represent the world. They held it, cradled it, balanced it with care. And perhaps the question that lingers after all these interpretations is not what the symbol meant in its time, but what it asks of us now. If early humans believed the world was something to be carried, carefully, deliberately, what have we done with that responsibility? And what might it mean to remember even faintly how to carry it again? There is a moment when, following the quiet trail of this ancient symbol across epochs, where one begins to realize that the handbag is less a motif than a memory, an imprint of a worldview that flickers like an afterimage every time we gaze into the earliest pages of humanity's story. It is not merely carved, it is echoed. It lingers at the edge of the world before history, then resurfaces in stories told by civilizations that believe themselves entirely separate. And the deeper one travels into its appearances, the more one senses that it marks not knowledge as we understand it, but something subtler, permission. Permission to cross a boundary, permission to enter a different arrangement of reality, permission to receive, carry, or transmit something that did not belong to the ordinary world. Such boundaries existed everywhere in the ancient mind, though not always in forms we would recognize. For early peoples, the world was layered with thresholds, between life and death, seen and unseen, dream and waking, night and dawn, sky and soil. Shamans, priests, and myth keepers did not simply navigate these boundaries, they embodied them. Their tools, garments, and gestures were themselves symbolic bridges. A container held by such a figure was not simply a bag, it was a sign that the bearer had crossed into a space where ordinary rules bent, where meaning coagulated into ritual action. At Göbekli Tepe, this sense of boundary permeates every carving. The animals are more than animals, the pillars more than pillars. Their arrangement suggests processions, cycles, cosmological alignments. The handbag motif appears in positions that emphasize transition, above forms, between forms, as if hovering at the moment when something passes from one state into another. Perhaps it marked a role rather than an object, the role of the one who carries the unseen, who mediates between the patterned world and the primal forces beneath it. In Mesopotamia, the motif becomes tethered to beings who act as custodians of balance. The Apkallu do not rule, they maintain, they do not ascend, they descend, bringing structure to humanity. Their handbags may have symbolized the tools of their task, but tools, in the ancient world, were more than functional. A measuring string could represent cosmic order, a stylus could signify the act of defining reality, a container could embody the very principle of boundedness, the idea that knowledge must be held, not spilled uncontrolled across the world. It is possible, then, that the handbag represented the simple but profound notion of containment, the gathering of elements into coherence. In a world recovering from climatic upheaval, where survival demanded the coordination of groups and the mapping of the sky, containment itself was sacred. Without containers, literal or conceptual, there could be no agriculture, no ritual storage of meaning, no continuity. And so the symbol becomes the visual shorthand for a deeper truth. That meaning requires form, that the cosmos itself requires a vessel in which to be carried. But the transition from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica complicates this neatly. There, the motif reappears not as the tool of a sage, but as the attribute of gods who shape reality through breath, maize, and blood. These gods are intimately tied to cycles, death and rebirth, planting and harvest, world creation and world collapse. Their handbags seem to represent the seed bundles of creation, containers of primordial substances used to reassemble the world after each cosmic resetting. In such a cosmology, the container is not a metaphor for order, it is the mechanism by which order is renewed. This cross-cultural resonance suggests that the motif may point to something more universal than we often acknowledge, humanity's earliest encounter with the fragility of continuity. When the world feels unstable, what matters most is what can be carried forward. Seeds, fire, stories, rituals, the fragments of order preserved against the possibility of collapse. Seen through this lens, the sudden disappearance of the motif becomes almost poetic. As societies stabilized through agriculture, writing, and governance, the urgency of carrying the cosmos lessened. Knowledge was stored in clay tablets, stone inscriptions, and centralized temples. Continuity became a function of bureaucracy rather than memory. The container was no longer a sacred image. It was a mundane tool, and as symbols that lose their sacred urgency quietly drift into silence. Yet the motif's absence still feels sharper than simple obsolescence. Its extinction does not align neatly with the rhythm of symbolic evolution. Instead, it feels like the fading of a dream upon waking, a dream one cannot fully recall, but which continues to haunt the edges of consciousness. The more one examines the motif, the more its disappearance begins to resemble forgetting on a civilizational scale. This forgetting is not unique. Across the world, countless early symbolic systems evaporated as their supporting cultures dissolved. The earliest signs from southeastern Anatolia, the enigmatic glyphs of early China, the untranslatable scripts of the Indus Valley, all are fragments severed from their original linguistic or cosmological frameworks. The handbag may simply be the most haunting of these fragments because it is so visibly intact, so recognizable in form, yet so opaque in meaning. And perhaps the opacity is the point. A symbol that survives while its meaning dies becomes something else, a mirror reflecting our longing for coherence. The modern fascination with the motif reveals more about us than it reveals about the ancient world. We look at it and see not only a mystery, but a possibility. That the world once held a meaning that we lost. That humanity once shared a conceptual landscape more unified than we dare imagine. That beneath the fractures of history lies an older, quieter continuity. This is why the symbol feels familiar, even though we cannot decode it. It resonates on a level deeper than analysis, on the level of archetype, where human memory shades into myth. The container is the archetype of preservation. The handle is the archetype of carrying. Together they suggest a movement of meaning across distances too great to cross directly. The movement from past to present, from chaos to order, from one world to the next. And if the handbag truly marks the act of carrying, then its disappearance may signify that the burden it once represented has been set down. The world has changed so profoundly that the old vessel is no longer needed. But the question remains, what was inside that vessel? What concept, principle, or way of being did early humans believe they were transporting through time? Was it a cosmology, a ritual, a memory of something so ancient it no longer fits within any narrative we recognize? In the silence left behind by the symbol's extinction, possibilities drift like dust in the dark. And perhaps the symbol's final message lies not in what it once meant, but in what it now provokes, the urge to remember, the sense that something essential lies just beyond articulation, waiting for the moment when humanity once again learns how to carry the world. Not as an empire or a system, but as something fragile, sacred, and alive. In this sense, the handbag is not merely a puzzle of the ancient world. It is a reminder that some truths are not lost, only dormant, that memory can sleep for millennia, and that symbols, even when emptied of meaning, retain the shape of what they once held, an invitation to wonder what it might mean to fill them again. There is a subtle ache woven through the story of this ancient symbol, an ache that has less to do with the object itself than with the sense of distance it represents. The handbag motif stands at the frontier of our understanding, like a stone left behind by travellers who move farther into a landscape we can no longer access. We see the imprint but not the footsteps. We see the shape but not the hands that carved it. And so the motif becomes a corridor, a quiet passageway leading toward a memory humanity once shared, but which now survives only in fragments scattered across continents, like remnants of a dream almost remembered. To understand why this symbol lingers so powerfully, one must consider the emotional dimension of ancient art. We often treat early carvings as utilitarian or ceremonial, but to the people who created them, symbols were not abstractions. They were living presences, anchors that stabilized a worldview in which every rock, animal and star pulsed with significance. Meaning was not something grasped intellectually, it was something encountered, something carried. And perhaps this is why the container-shaped motif appears again and again. Because early humans understood that knowledge must be held gently, moved carefully, protected through upheaval. Göbekli Tepe, with its monumental enclosures and staggering antiquity, offers a glimpse into this mindset. The site was not merely a gathering place, it was a stage on which the cosmos was reenacted. The pillars, arranged in rings, resembled giant beings standing in a circle, guardians of a worldview that revolved around cycles, transformation and reciprocity. The handbag motif appears here not as an isolated carving, but as part of a larger narrative, one that we can see only dimly through its incomplete traces. It is positioned above animals, between symbols, as if marking a moment of transition, an indication that something was being held between states of being. Some researchers have proposed that Göbekli Tepe served as a ceremonial laboratory where rituals of death, rebirth, and renewal were practiced. If this is true, the handbag could symbolize the vessel in which such transformations were conceptually carried, the place where the raw substance of experience was gathered and reorganized into meaning. In this reading, the object becomes almost metaphysical, a container not of physical seeds, but of symbolic ones. In Mesopotamia, the motif undergoes a subtle shift. It becomes tied to the Apkallu, figures who bring stability to the earlier cities. These sages act as mediators not between worlds, but between chaos and order. Their work is described in texts not as creative in the mythic sense, but as organizational, measuring temples, instructing kings, purifying spaces, establishing boundaries. And boundaries, in ancient thought, were not merely physical, they were cosmic. To set a boundary was to carve a stable island in the ocean of the unknown. The handbag in this context could represent the principle of boundedness, the idea that creation requires limits. A universe must be held within invisible walls. But the most intriguing aspect of the Mesopotamian depictions is that the bag sometimes appears alongside pine cones or fruit-like objects, symbols associated with fertilization or the renewal of life. This combination suggests that the motif may represent not simply a container, but a womb of transformation, a place where raw material becomes something new. If this is so, then the container is a metaphor for potential held in suspension, waiting to be activated by a ritual or intention. When the motif leaps across the ocean and reappears in Mesoamerica, it does so with remarkable fidelity. The Olmec, one of the earliest known civilizations of the Americas, carved gods holding the same curved-handled container. These gods are associated not only with fertility and creation, but with the introduction of order, calendars, measurements, cycles of time. The Maya carried this symbolism forward, treating sacred bundles as repositories of lineage, identity, and cosmological truth. These bundles were not opened casually, they contained the essence of the world as understood by their caretakers. The bag, in this sense, was a vessel of memory. It is tempting to assume cultural contact, but such contact has never been demonstrated. The more likely explanation is that early humans everywhere felt the same need, to hold meaning in a form that could be carried beyond catastrophe. In a world shaped by environmental instability, migration, and the unpredictability of life, the container became a universal symbol of continuity. And continuity, fragile, precious, inherited, may be the true subject of the handbag. Still, one cannot ignore the symbol's disappearance. The fact that it vanishes before the rise of classical civilizations suggests that its significance belonged to a worldview incompatible with the one that later emerged. The hierarchical, text-based societies of the Bronze Age and beyond no longer needed a symbol of portable meaning. They had archives, temples, dynasties. Their world was held in stone and clay, not in ritual containers. Knowledge became centralized. Authority became encoded in law rather than memory. And yet, despite this shift, the appearance of the handbag in such distant cultures hints that early humanity may have shared a deeper unity of thought, a unity that predates the divisions of language, geography, and politics. If this is true, then the symbol becomes not a puzzle to solve, but a reminder of a time when humans saw themselves as part of a continuum rather than a hierarchy. a time when knowledge was dispersed across communities, carried by individuals who moved through the world with ritual tools that embodied cosmological truths. The motif's recurrence at thresholds, between animals and humans, between gods and kings, between creation and civilization, suggests that it marked the passage from one mode of being into another. In this sense, the handbag is less a representation of an object, and more a symbol of transition itself, a marker of the moments when humanity stepped into new worlds. But there is still another possibility, one that lingers quietly at the edge of the archaeological record. Perhaps the motif represents an older form of wisdom that humanity once held but later let slip, a kind of ancestral knowledge not tied to agriculture or writing, but to a more intuitive structure of thought, one that perceived the world as interconnected rather than compartmentalized. If this is so, then its disappearance may signal not progress, but amnesia. Standing before the ancient carvings today, whether on the limestone pillars of Anatolia, the reliefs of Assyria, or the stone monuments of Mesoamerica, one feels the presence of something both familiar and unreachable. The symbol seems to vibrate with memory, but the memory is inaccessible, sealed behind layers of cultural sediment. And perhaps that is the most haunting aspect of the motif, that it offers us a glimpse of a worldview we once inhabited but can no longer fully recall. The handbag leaves us with a quiet question. What happens to a civilization when it forgets the meaning of its oldest symbol? Does the forgetting signal an ending, or does it open the way for new forms of meaning to emerge? And in the long expanse of time, might the symbol one day awaken again, not to reveal its original purpose, but to remind us that wisdom is something we must choose to carry, or risk losing forever? There is a point along this long and winding trail where the handbag motif begins to feel less like an artifact we are studying, and more like a voice that keeps trying to speak, softly, insistently, from behind the closed door of prehistory. It is a voice without language, without linear narrative, yet unmistakably present. Each new appearance of the motif feels like another tap on the shoulder, another reminder that we are circling something we have not yet learned how to face directly. Not a forgotten object, but a forgotten orientation. Not a tool, but a way of seeing. The deeper one travels into the layers of ancient art, the more one begins to sense that the handbag belonged to a symbolic system, grounded not in representation, but in relationship. Early humans did not draw to describe, they drew to connect. They carved to anchor ritual memory, to map the invisible, to compress stories too large to speak. In that world, a single symbol could embody a cosmos of associations. A carved fox might represent cunning, the night, or a star. A serpent might hold meanings of death, rebirth, and celestial movement all at once. Within such a symbolic grammar, the handbag could easily have functioned not as a depiction of a literal object, but as a container for an entire category of meaning, one we're no longer fluent enough to decode. At Göbekli Tepe, the symbol appears at moments that feel like pauses in a sentence, a kind of punctuation in stone. It sits above animals that seem arranged not randomly but systematically. Perhaps the animals encoded mythic stories, or perhaps they served as markers of time, signifying seasons or stars. The handbag might then have been the conceptual frame holding these cycles together, the bracket within which the cosmos unfolds. The more one studies the composition, the less it looks like art, and the more it resembles a diagram, a map, a structure for thought. This idea gains strength when we consider how early people experienced the world. Without writing, they relied on memory frameworks, symbolic systems that enabled communities to retain knowledge across generations. Rituals often acted as mnemonic devices, embedding history, cosmology, and ethics into choreographed sequences. Sacred spaces amplified these memories, functioning as physical cues for complex cognitive structures. Göbekli Tepe, Stonehenge, the early mound sites of the Americas, each seems to whisper the same truth, that early humans encoded knowledge spatially, symbolically, and communally, rather than textually. Within such a worldview, a container symbol may have represented the act of preserving the unpreservable, time, meaning, continuity. And if this were true, the disappearance of the motif might signal a shift in how humanity stored its knowledge. Once writing emerged, the burden of carrying memory passed from ritual to record. Knowledge moved from bodies and ceremonies into clay tablets and walls. The symbolic container was replaced by literal repositories, libraries, archives, temples. The world no longer needed a metaphor for what it could now store physically. Yet this explanation does not fully account for the motif's appearance in cultures separated by an ocean. The Olmec and early Maya did not borrow symbols from the Near East. Their cosmological languages evolved independently. And yet, the container appears with uncanny fidelity. What does one make of this? Either the motif encodes something so fundamental to early cognition that it emerged spontaneously across multiple continents, or it belonged to a symbolic vocabulary older than any known migration pattern. Some anthropologists suggest that early humans everywhere confronted the same existential challenges: how to preserve knowledge through cycles of destruction, how to maintain continuity across generations, how to conceptualize the invisible forces shaping existence. The container, as metaphor, may have been among the first universal solutions, a shared conceptual anchor. It is not impossible to imagine that the earliest humans carried similar symbolic grammars before dispersing across the globe, and that fragments of those grammars reappeared independently when new civilizations began rebuilding cosmological frameworks. But the disappearance of the motif suggests that whatever conceptual system once sustained it dissolved so thoroughly that even cultures capable of extraordinary symbolic innovation, Sumer, Egypt, China, the Maya, no longer found use for it. Its extinction feels like a conceptual horizon, marking the boundary between two different modes of human thought. Perhaps the symbol belonged to a world where knowledge was not something possessed, but something participated in. A world where the cosmos was not described, but enacted. When later societies shifted toward hierarchical organization, written record-keeping and centralized authority, symbols emphasizing continuity and collective memory may have been overshadowed by symbols representing power, sovereignty, and divine legitimacy. Scepters replaced containers, thrones replaced bundles. The cosmos became fixed rather than carried, and yet the handbag does not feel like a symbol that vanished through disuse. It feels like one that slipped away because its meaning depended on a worldview that fractured. A worldview in which the human role was not to dominate the cosmos, but to maintain it, to carry it as a responsibility rather than rule it as a possession. When one stands before the reliefs of Mesopotamia or the sculptures of the Olmec, the container appears almost humble. But humility can mask profundity. In many spiritual traditions, the vessels that hold sacred truth, the pot, the bowl, the gourd, the satchel, are unremarkable in form. Their significance lies not in their appearance, but in what they conceptually contain. Perhaps the real mystery is not what the handbag was, but what it asked of those who understood it. To carry knowledge requires more than mere possession. It requires continuity, reverence, responsibility. It requires the recognition that meaning is not static but must be tended, transported, renewed. If the motif embodied such a principle, then its disappearance might say something unsettling: that humanity, at some point, stopped seeing itself as the carrier of the cosmos, and so the symbol lingers now as a faint echo of a time when we held something in our hands that we no longer recognize, a time when the world was not yet divided between sacred and secular, myth and fact, sky and earth, a time when the cosmos could be held, gently, deliberately, as something fragile enough to fit in a vessel. The handbag, carved into stone across continents and millennia, whispers of a forgotten intimacy between humans and the universe, and it leaves us with the question that feels as vast as the horizon of prehistory itself. If early humans believed the cosmos could be carried, what did they think would happen if they ever dropped it? And, without realizing it, have we? There comes a moment after tracing the symbol across pillars, tablets, and sculpted stone when the handbag motif begins to feel like a kind of gravitational center, an object so small, yet somehow bending the entire landscape of early human meaning toward itself. It is as if the symbol exerts a quiet pull on our imagination precisely because it seems to mark the outlines of something we can't quite touch, a forgotten framework, a missing layer in the architecture of ancient thought. And as one studies it deeper, the mystery transforms from a question about what the symbol meant to a question about what kind of mind could have created it, a mind shaped by experiences and orientations nearly inaccessible to us now. Part of the difficulty in deciphering the motif lies in the way modern thought separates the sacred from the mundane, the symbolic from the functional, the cosmos from the individual. Early humans did not make such distinctions. For them, everything that endured, star patterns, animal migrations, ritual performances, participated in an interwoven system of significance. And the handbag, appearing with deliberate repetition in humanity's earliest ritual centres, seems to emerge from this woven system. Its meaning, whatever it once was, may have been inseparable from a worldview in which knowledge was not possessed or recorded, but enacted and carried. At Göbekli Tepe, this enactment is visible in the arrangement of space itself. The enclosures, oriented with an almost obsessive symmetry, seem designed to create a movement of bodies and attention. Rituals likely unfolded not as linear events, but as cyclical processes tied to celestial phenomena or seasonal rhythms. Within such a framework, symbols carved into the pillars may have served as narrative cues, markers of transitions or thresholds in ceremonial sequences. The handbag could then represent the moment when something was taken up from one state and brought into another. A symbolic hinge, a pivot, a moment of gathering before transformation. This interpretation resonates with the Mesopotamian version of the motif. The Apkallu, figures who straddle the boundary between myth and history, hold the bag with a kind of formal stillness. They do not appear to be using it, but displaying it. In ancient ritual contexts, such display often communicated legitimacy, authority, and continuity. Objects held by divine or semi-divine beings served as assurances that certain powers had been bestowed. The bag, in this case, may have symbolized not a physical item, but a condition, an endowed capacity to mediate between order and chaos. The bearer was not simply carrying a tool, he was carrying the right to shape reality. If this was true in Mesopotamia, then what does it mean that the same symbol appears in Mesoamerica, where creation myths describe gods carrying the ingredients of life in bundles or pouches? In the Popol Vuh, the foundational text of the Maya, creators form the world using substances that must be gathered, shaped, and preserved. These substances are often carried in containers that are not described in technical terms, but in cosmological ones. A bundle might contain maize, but also ancestry, blood, but also identity, a piece of jade, but also the breath of life. The bag in this context becomes a vessel of layered meaning, material, cosmic, and ancestral all at once. This cross-cultural parallel hints at a deeper intuition. Early humans everywhere may have recognized that meaning is something that must be held together. It does not arise spontaneously. It must be gathered, protected, carried through time, and so the motif becomes a symbol of continuity, of the human attempt to preserve coherence in a world that threatens constantly to fragment. But coherence is fragile, and the ancient world was marked by cycles of disruption. Climate shifts, migrations, ecological collapse, conflict. Each event may have fractured the symbolic systems that once sustained communities. The disappearance of the handbag motif might not reflect obsolescence so much as the breaking of a chain, a rupture in the continuity of meaning transmission. This rupture becomes more apparent when we consider how later civilizations reconfigured symbolic landscapes. As writing entrenched itself, meaning shifted from performance to inscription. Rituals became codified, cosmologies became hierarchical. The new symbols of order reflected this change. Axes of divine kingship, scepters of sovereignty, scrolls of law. These symbols pointed upward, toward power, not inward, toward continuity. The bag, with its humble shape and quiet implication of stewardship, belonged to a different order of thought. It may have represented a worldview in which humans were not rulers of the cosmos, but carriers of it. This older worldview surfaces faintly in the world's earliest myths. Many creation stories describe primordial beings not as conquerors, but as caretakers, figures who transport seeds of order through darkness, who weave environments into stability, who nurture worlds into being. The act of carrying is central. It implies caution, responsibility, gentleness. A cosmos carried is a cosmos respected. If the handbag symbolized this primordial relationship, then its disappearance could mark the moment when humanity shifted from carrying the world to controlling it. A subtle but profound realignment of orientation. The cosmos, once fragile enough to be held, becomes instead something to be subdued, measured, and owned. And yet, the symbol's persistence across such distant cultures suggests that it belonged to a period before these orientations diverged. A period that some scholars call deep mythic time, an era of shared human imagination before the great dispersals and cultural fracture points. In this era, certain symbols may have crystallized from universal human experiences, carrying food, carrying fire, carrying children, carrying stories. The container becomes a way of conceptualizing agency, memory, and the passage of sacred responsibility. When seen from this perspective, the handbag is not an enigma to be decoded, but an artifact of our earliest attempts to understand continuity itself. It marks the transition from chaos into coherence, from multiplicity into meaning. It represents a gesture, hands holding something precious enough to shape the future. And perhaps the reason we cannot decipher the symbol now is because the symbolic ecosystem that once gave it meaning has dissolved completely. We are trying to interpret a word from a language with no surviving grammar, a vessel without its contents, a memory without its story. Yet even in its silence, the motif speaks. It speaks of the fragility of meaning, of the ways symbols can survive long after their worlds have vanished, of the strange endurance of forms that no longer hold the concepts they once carried. In this silence, a quiet question emerges. If the symbol once embodied the human responsibility to carry the cosmos, what does its disappearance suggest about who we have become? Have we set down the burden without realizing it? And if so, what was lost in the moment we let it slip from our collective hands? The handbag, carved into stone and scattered across ages, feels like a reminder left for a future humanity. One that would someday look back and wonder what it once carried, and whether it is possible to reclaim a sense of meaning not through dominance, but through stewardship. There is a peculiar sensation that arises when the handbag motif appears for the 100th time in one's research. Not the shock of recognition, nor the curiosity of comparison, but a quieter, deeper feeling. The sense that the symbol is pointing not toward itself, but toward the absence surrounding it. Like a fossil whose imprint reveals more about the creature's shape than its bones ever could, the handbag seems to outline a missing intellectual structure, a framework once shared by early humanity, now dissolved into dust. The symbol survives, but the worldview that shaped it does not, and so we peer through the narrow aperture of its carved silhouette, searching for the light of a vanished cosmology. This feeling grows stronger when one considers how early people understood the flow of time. In many pre-agricultural societies, time was not a straight line, it was a cycle, a spiral, a returning river. The future was not ahead but around. The past was not behind but beneath. Rituals did not commemorate events, they reenacted them, refreshed them, folded them back into the living present. If the handbag belonged to such a cyclical worldview, its meaning would have been inseparable from the rhythms of ceremony, the movement of stars, the migration of animals, the return of constellations no longer visible from our polluted skies. This cyclical orientation toward time makes sense at Göbekli Tepe, where the enclosures may encode cosmic cycles. The placement of animals, scorpions, boars, cranes, could correspond to star clusters. The handbag perched above them may have represented the container of these cycles, the vessel that gathers the movements of the heavens into comprehensible patterns. The curved top of the motif, arching downward like the dome of a sky, becomes suggestive. The straight-sided base becomes a horizon line. The handle becomes the arc of celestial motion. If this interpretation holds, the handbag could be nothing less than an early cosmogram, a schematic representation of the sky as carried by the hands of creation. But symbols rarely hold only one meaning. They layer, as sediment layers on riverbanks. In Mesopotamia, the handbag held by the Apkallu sits within a context where cosmic order is not cyclical, but administrated. The sages maintain balance through rituals of purification and measurement. Their bags may symbolize the principles they wield, the laws, cycles, and boundaries that hold the world in its proper configuration. But even here, something older seems to hum beneath the reliefs. The Apkallu were said to emerge from the freshwater abyss, the Abzu, a realm associated with origin, depth, and the unmanifest. A container held by such beings could represent the transfer of primordial substance into the world of form. This deep resonance becomes even more striking when the motif appears in Mesoamerica. There, the gods carry bundles containing the ingredients of creation. Maize kernels, sacred stones, fluid essences. These bundles are not merely objects, they are the wombs of worlds. When the world collapses, as it does repeatedly in Mesoamerican cosmology, the gods gather its remnants into these bundles before shaping a new one. This pattern suggests an older idea, that creation is not a singular event but a rhythm, a cycle of collapse and renewal. The container becomes the stable point in this cycle, the continuity that persists through cosmic death and rebirth. If the handbag represents this continuity, this ability to carry the seed of order through chaos, its disappearance becomes even more poignant. Perhaps later civilizations no longer perceived the cosmos as something fragile enough to require carrying. Perhaps the shift from cyclicality to linearity, from ritual renewal to administrative permanence, rendered the container obsolete. In a world of empire and hierarchy, continuity is supplied through monuments, laws, and force, not through symbolic stewardship. Yet the motif's extinction may also reveal a subtler loss, the fading of humanity's earliest metaphors. Before the rise of formal writing, early humans used objects as conceptual anchors. A basket held food, but also potential. A gourd held water, but also the power to sustain life. A container was not a mere tool, it was a symbol of the capacity to gather, preserve, and protect. As humanity's symbolic systems grew more complex, this primal metaphor may have been overshadowed by more specialized symbols. The cosmic container became the royal scepter. The ritual bundle became the legal tablet. The shaman's gourd became the priest's chalice, meaning splintered. Still, the ancient symbol's consistency across continents suggests that its core metaphor once lay very close to the foundation of human cognition. Carrying is among the oldest human actions. We carried our young before we built our homes. We carried stones before we shaped tools. We carried fire before we learned to spark it. To carry is to preserve continuity, to move something precious through space, through danger, through time. If the handbag captures this primordial act, then it embodies a truth older than agriculture, older than cities, older even than myths carved in stone, that the survival of meaning requires movement. Yet even as we reconstruct these interpretations, the symbol resists resolution. It does not collapse into a single definition. Instead, it hovers at the edge of coherence, like a word on the tip of the tongue. This resistance may be telling. Perhaps the handbag was intentionally ambiguous, an open vessel into which multiple meanings could be poured depending on context. The symbol may have been a conceptual tool that gained meaning only in relation to ritual action. Without the action, the symbol becomes mute. This raises an unsettling possibility, that the disappearance of the motif reflects not a loss of interest, but a loss of cultural capacity. When societies shift from embodied ritual systems to textual ones, symbols requiring performance to activate their meaning become unintelligible. If the handbag required ritual enactment, movement, gesture, transformation, its meaning would evaporate once those rituals ceased. And so we are left with a carved shape, severed from the currents that once animated it. Perhaps this is why modern fascination with the motif feels tinged with melancholy. We are reaching across a chasm of time towards something that cannot be recovered in full. The symbol is intact, but the world that held it is gone. And yet, the recurrence of the motif across continents gives us a rare glimpse of that vanished world's unity. It suggests that early humanity, dispersed as it was, may have shared a deep and intuitive understanding of continuity, responsibility, and cosmological stewardship. As the symbol begins to dissolve into the silence of history, it leaves behind a final, delicate question. If early humans saw themselves as carriers of the world's fragile order, what does it mean that we no longer recognize the vessel in which they once held it? And what, if anything, remains of that ancient responsibility now that the symbol has slipped from our collective hands? Perhaps the handbag is not a message from the past, but an invitation, a reminder that meaning, like the cosmos, must be held carefully, and that some responsibilities, once forgotten, wait quietly for someone to lift them again. There is a strange gravity that gathers around the handbag motif as one approaches the final stretch of its long trail through prehistory. It is no longer simply a symbol. We have seen too much, followed too many echoes, stepped too close to the thresholds it marks. By now, the motif feels like an aperture, an opening through which the earliest human imagination once poured its understanding of the world. And the closer we look, the more it becomes apparent that the mystery of the handbag is not really about the object at all. It is about the worldview that could imagine a universe small enough, intimate enough, relational enough to be carried. This intimacy with the cosmos is perhaps easiest to see in the context of Göbekli Tepe. Even after decades of research, the site remains a paradox. It is older than pottery, older than agriculture, older than writing, yet its scale and precision surpass many later monuments. The people who carved those pillars lived in a world without domesticated crops or formal hierarchy, and yet they constructed something that required cooperation on a scale difficult to fathom. Their worldview must have been cohesive, their cosmology compelling, their rituals powerful enough to bind dispersed groups into shared purpose. In this context, the handbag, perched above symbolic animals, might have signified the collective act of carrying knowledge, memory and meaning across seasonal migrations and generational transitions. By the time the motif reappears in Mesopotamia, the world has transformed. Cities rise, kings rule, writing etches permanence into clay. But the enduring presence of the handbag suggests that certain ideas survived the shift. The Apkallu, those enigmatic figures whose mythic biographies blur the line between deity and sage, carry the container in a manner that feels almost ceremonial. They do not grasp it, they present it, as if they are offering or revealing a principle essential to the maintenance of cosmic order. Some have argued that the Apkallu's bag contained ritual objects, but if that were all, why replicate the form with such meticulous consistency across centuries? Why place it in scenes of mythic resonance, in reliefs that emphasize cosmic balance and foundational knowledge? The careful symmetry of the images suggests that the object symbolizes something far more abstract, something that the culture valued enough to preserve visually even as its textual traditions evolved. The mystery deepens when the motif leaps, without any known transmission, into Mesoamerica. The Olmec, Maya, and other early American cultures viewed creation not as a singular moment, but as a series of cycles separated by destruction. Gods carried bundles of essence from one age into the next, preserving whatever fragments survived cosmic catastrophe. These bundles served as seeds for the next world, seeds of order, seeds of time, seeds of identity. When carved into stone, the handbag held by American deities resembles precisely this function, the vessel that gathers the remnants of one cosmos so they may be reorganized into another. If we accept that the container symbolizes continuity through upheaval, then the motif's cross-cultural presence becomes less surprising. Early humans everywhere faced cycles of climatic instability, population dispersal, and discontinuity. It is reasonable to imagine that they developed metaphors to conceptualize resilience, metaphors embodied in portable, potent symbols. A container is the simplest and most universal of these metaphors. It holds, it protects, it carries, it transforms. But what is striking is not simply that the motif appears across continents, it is that it disappears everywhere. Not slowly, not incrementally, but abruptly, as if an entire way of thinking fell out of use. The people of later eras no longer carved the symbol. They no longer invoked it. They no longer recognized it. What could erase such a powerful symbol so completely? One possibility is the rise of systems that centralized meaning. Writing, governance, priestly hierarchy. These restructured the human relationship to knowledge. Continuity was no longer maintained through ritual performance and communal memory. It was maintained through archives, institutions, and authority. Knowledge no longer needed to be carried. It was stored. And once stored, it no longer needed a symbol for carrying. Another possibility is that the worldview that produced the symbol became incompatible with emerging religious cosmologies. The handbag implied a cosmos shared, tended, held lightly by human hands. Later religions and empires often imagined a cosmos ruled by external deities or enforced by kings. Such a worldview leaves little room for the older metaphor of stewardship. Authority replaced continuity, dominion replaced participation. But the most haunting possibility is this: the symbol belonged to a cognitive world that simply fell out of reach. A world where the boundary between the physical and the symbolic was permeable, where objects were more than tools. They were metaphors made tangible. When the ritual ecologies that sustained these metaphors dissolved, the metaphors dissolved as well. The symbol remains, but the conceptual world that animated it has died. And yet, the motif's endurance across continents hints that the worldview was once shared widely enough to leave traces in multiple cultural lineages. This deep resonance suggests that the symbol may encode something fundamental to the earliest human experience, the recognition that continuity must be carried or it will be lost. This truth is universal, it is psychological, it is existential, but the appearance of the motif in ritual and cosmological context suggests an even deeper insight, that early humans saw themselves as participating in the maintenance of the cosmos. They were not passive inhabitants, they were active caretakers. The cosmos was not a machine operating independently, it was a living system requiring human attention and ritual participation. To carry the handbag may have been to acknowledge this responsibility. This raises an unsettling question. What happens when a civilization forgets that it is responsible for carrying the world? What happens when the shared vessel is set down, abandoned, or ignored? The loss of the handbag motif may mark precisely that moment, the moment humanity stopped seeing itself as a participant in cosmic order and began seeing itself as a master of it. The moment stewardship gave way to control, the moment the vessel of meaning slipped from our collective hands. And perhaps that is why the symbol haunts us now, emerging from the dust in carved stone and worn reliefs. Perhaps it returns at a moment when the world feels unsteady again, when continuity feels fragile, and when the questions that shaped early humanity begin to echo in our own fractured age. It is tempting to imagine that the symbol holds a secret waiting to be deciphered, but perhaps its message is simpler and more profound. That meaning must be carried, not assumed. That cosmology is not inherited fully, it must be tended. That the world in all its vastness is still something fragile enough to fit inside a vessel, if only we remember how to hold it. And so, as the motif stands at the threshold of our understanding, it leaves us with a final lingering question. In the long arc of human history, what have we carried forward, and what have we let slip? And are we still capable of recognizing the vessel if it appears again, quietly, asking to be lifted? There is a quiet trembling that comes over the mind when it reaches the final curve in this long and ancient trail, as though one stands not at an ending, but at the edge of a vast, unlit plain where the past dissolves into something deeper than memory. The handbag motif, which began as a curiosity carved into weathered limestone, now feels like a companion, an echo that has followed us across continents, across epochs, across the widening gulf between what humanity once understood and what it later forgot. And yet even here, in the final steps of this journey, the symbol refuses resolution. It does not yield meaning, it reveals presence. It reveals that something was once carried, faithfully, purposefully across millennia, and then, somehow, was set down. Perhaps all we can do now is trace the shape of what remains. The more we examine the motif across cultures, the more it becomes clear that the people who carved it did not think of the world as a cold expanse of physical laws. They conceived of reality as something participatory, relational, alive. To them, the cosmos was not an object to be observed, but a process to be upheld. Ritual was not superstition, it was maintenance. Myth was not fiction, it was the memory of how things stayed whole. Knowledge was not accumulation, it was stewardship. And so it makes sense that their most enigmatic symbol might represent a vessel, a reminder that everything precious must be carried, tended, protected through the long turbulence of time. At Göbekli Tepe, the container appears as a hovering presence, a hinge between animal symbols that may encode constellations or mythic categories. Its placement suggests a moment of gathering, of alignment, of bringing chaos into coherence. The people who carved it were living at the transition between foraging and farming, between fluid bands and ritual gatherings, between worlds. Perhaps the motif marked the threshold of those transitions, the container of possibility. In Mesopotamia, the motif becomes sharper, more defined. The Apkallu carry it as they purify temples and instruct kings. Their presence bridges the abyss of prehistory and the dawn of written civilization. If the bag symbolized the continuity of sacred responsibility, then its appearance in their hands may mark the last moment when the old worldview still breathed within the new. A memory carried forward even as writing, cities, and hierarchy transformed the structure of human society. And then, suddenly, impossibly, the motif leaps across an ocean. The Olmec and Maya place it in the hands of gods who mold creation, who restart worlds, who carry seeds of order through cosmic destruction. These gods do not conquer the cosmos, they shepherd it. Their bundles contain not objects but essences, breath, time, identity, direction. The motif becomes the womb of reality itself. Across all these contexts, the symbol shares a single thread. It marks the act of carrying something through transition, through danger, through collapse, through transformation. It is the vessel of continuity. But then the vessel disappears. Its extinction is almost too abrupt to ignore. It fades from the record not because the symbol evolves, but because the worldview that sustained it fractures. Writing replaces ritual memory. Institutions replace communal stewardship. Hierarchy replaces reciprocity. And meaning becomes something stored, not carried. This shift, subtle, invisible, civilizational, may hold the answer to the motif's silence. A symbol meant to embody continuity becomes irrelevant in a world that no longer understands continuity as a responsibility. A container meant to hold the fragile cosmos becomes unnecessary in a world that imagines the cosmos immovable, external, ruled rather than tended. And yet, the motif lingers in stone, waiting. The deeper one contemplates its disappearance, the more one senses that humanity may have lost something profound, an orientation toward the world that saw existence as an interwoven whole rather than an assemblage of parts. Early humans lived within a cosmos that needed care. We live within one we presume will endure without us. The difference is stark, and perhaps perilous. For if the handbag once symbolized the carrying of continuity, cosmic, cultural, ancestral, its absence may reflect a quiet abandonment of that role. We became inheritors who forgot what we inherited, custodians who misplaced the keys, carriers who set down the vessel before understanding what it held. And yet, the motif's endurance across continents suggests that this ancient understanding was once shared widely, almost instinctively. It was not the property of a single culture, it was a human intuition. The intuition that meaning survives only when carried with care. As this journey reaches its final turning, the symbol leaves us with a refrain that is not a puzzle but a question, one far less concerned with prehistoric rituals than with the present moment. What are we carrying now, and what have we let slip? The ancients carved their answer into stone. They carved it into the hands of beings who straddled the boundary between worlds. They carved it into monuments older than agriculture, older than cities, older than myth as we know it. Their answer was simple, almost heartbreakingly so. Carry what matters, or risk losing everything. We do not know precisely what the symbol meant to them. Perhaps we never will. But its persistence suggests that whatever it represented was essential enough to be remembered across oceans, and forgotten only after the world had changed beyond recognition. And so the handbag, small, humble, enigmatic, becomes the concluding whisper of humanity's first worldview. A worldview that understood the cosmos not as a machine, but as a living pattern, not as a domain to be ruled, but as something to be held gently, moved carefully, protected across the fragile span of time. As this whisper fades into the dark, the motif offers one last lingering image, a pair of hands carved in ancient stone, lifting a vessel toward the horizon, offering it to the future, trusting that someone, somewhere, would someday reach out and carry it onward. Whether we recognize the vessel or not is a question only the present can answer.